The paper lies under glass now, quiet and browned by age, but it does not feel harmless. Its edges are torn, its surface is crowded with coastlines, islands, compass lines, painted creatures, inscriptions, and the restless geometry of a world being pulled into shape. At first glance, it looks like an artifact from the age of sails, one more old map among many old maps, beautiful because it is imperfect, mysterious because it is damaged. But then the eye begins to recognize things. A western coast of Africa, the curve of the Atlantic, the shoulder of South America, islands scattered like stepping stones across an ocean that, not long before this map was drawn, many Europeans had only begun to imagine as a road rather than a barrier, and below all of it, along the lower edge of the fragment, there is a landform that has made people lean closer for more than a century, searching its inked coastline as if it might be hiding a secret the modern world was never meant to find. The map is famous now because it seems to stand at the edge of the impossible. Drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, it survives only as a fragment, a torn remnant of something larger, and yet that remnant has carried a strange power. It appears to gather knowledge from different worlds, Islamic geography, Portuguese voyages, Spanish discoveries, older Mediterranean sea charts, perhaps even maps that no longer exist. It belongs to an era when the known world is expanding violently and rapidly, when empires are searching across oceans, when sailors return with rumours of unfamiliar coasts, and rulers turn those rumours into claims. But the map also seems to whisper of something older. In popular imagination, it has become a doorway into a forbidden possibility that someone, somewhere, knew the shape of the world before they should have known it. That is the true force of the object. It is not simply a map, it is a challenge. It asks how knowledge survives. It asks how people copy what they do not fully understand. It asks how a coastline can travel from sailor to pilot, from pilot to chartmaker, from chartmaker to archive, and from archive into a torn piece of gazelle skin that outlives the men who made it. It asks whether a mistaken line can become a mystery, whether an ordinary distortion can grow into a legend, and whether the past sometimes looks more advanced than it was because we're staring at it from the wrong angle. The scene of its rediscovery almost feels too neat, as if written for a story about hidden history. In the early 20th century, when the old imperial world of the Ottomans has already fallen and the new Turkish Republic is looking again at its inherited past, workers in Istanbul are sorting through materials in Topkapı Palace, once the seat of sultans. There, among old documents, they find the map. It is not complete. It is not neatly preserved as a grand world chart. It is only a portion. But even this portion is enough to raise questions. The name of Piri Reis appears on it. The date is clear enough. The Atlantic world is there. The Americas are there, at least in part. And this alone is astonishing, because the map is made barely 2 decades after Columbus's first voyage across the ocean. It belongs to the first generation of maps trying to make sense of a planet suddenly larger than the inherited geography of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia had allowed. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this map is not a simple puzzle with a clean answer hidden at the end. It is stranger than that. The more carefully it is studied, the less it behaves like the perfect relic of a lost super-civilization, and the more it becomes something perhaps even more fascinating, a survival of human uncertainty at the exact moment when the world was being redrawn. To understand why it captured so many imaginations, one has to picture the age that produced it. In 1513, the world is not yet mapped as a single continuous globe in the way modern people take for granted. Continents are not stable shapes in schoolroom colours. Oceans are not empty blue spaces crossed by neat dotted lines. The planet is a dangerous accumulation of reports. Sailors know stretches of coast intimately and know almost nothing beyond them. A pilot might understand the approach to a harbour, the colour of water over shoals, the direction of winds near a cape, the smell of land after weeks at sea. But a ruler in a palace sees only the final abstraction a line on a surface. And between those two kinds of knowledge, between wet rope and ink, much can change. The Peary race map belongs to that unstable middle world. It is built from sources, and Peary himself says so in the notes written across it. He does not pretend to have sailed every shore. He presents himself as a compiler, a man gathering charts and reports from different hands. Some of those sources, he claims, include maps used by Columbus. Others may have come from Portuguese mariners, Arab geographers, older Mediterranean traditions, and the accumulated experience of pilots who had learned the Atlantic coast by coast. The evidence remains incomplete, because the original source maps are mostly gone. This absence is part of the spell. Lost sources leave room for speculation. A vanished chart can become almost anything in the imagination a practical sailor's guide. A secret imperial document, a remnant of ancient science, or a message from a forgotten civilization. But maps are not photographs of the world. They are arguments. They are acts of selection, compression, guesswork, inheritance, and desire. A map can preserve real knowledge and serious error on the same sheet. It can show one coastline with startling confidence, and another as a rumour stretched into shape. It can put a true island in the wrong place, turn a continent into a curve, attach one land to another, or repeat an old mistake simply because the mistake came from a respected source. Early maps often carry generations of thinking at once, like a wall with older paint showing through newer paint. That is why the Peary race map is so powerful. It is not a window onto one moment. It is a layered object, and some of its layers may be older than the man who signed it. The most famous claim about the map is also the most dramatic, that it shows Antarctica centuries before Europeans officially saw the frozen continent, and perhaps even shows it without ice. This idea has travelled widely because it is irresistible. A continent buried beneath ice, drawn long before its discovery, would imply knowledge from some vanished age, some civilization capable of surveying the globe before history admits such a thing existed. It would turn the map from an extraordinary early modern artifact into evidence of a lost world. But mainstream historians and cartographers are cautious, and for good reason. The shape identified by some as Antarctica is more commonly understood as a distorted continuation of South America or as a speculative southern land. Shaped by cartographic habits rather than by direct observation, no single explanation fully accounts for every oddity. But the leap from oddity to lost global civilization is far larger than the evidence can carry. Still, dismissing the wildest claim does not make the map ordinary. That is the mistake. The real mystery does not vanish when the unsupported theory is set aside. In some ways, it deepens, because the true question becomes more human and more difficult. How did a 16th century Ottoman admiral assemble such a complicated vision of the Atlantic world? How did information gathered by rivals, enemies, merchants, captives, pilots, and explorers move through a connected but divided world? How much did Islamic scholars know about European voyages? How quickly did maps circulate? What did Columbus's lost charts look like? What was copied accurately? What was misunderstood? and what vanished before modern historians could examine it. The map sits at the meeting point of empires. To the west, Spain and Portugal are forcing open sea routes with brutal ambition. To the east, the Ottoman Empire commands a vast world of ports, scholars, merchants, and military power. The Mediterranean is not a quiet boundary between civilizations. It is a crowded sea of trade, piracy, diplomacy, espionage, religious conflict, and shared knowledge. Ships are captured, pilots are interrogated, charts are stolen, bought, copied, and adapted. A coastline discovered under one flag may appear later in the archive of another. The modern habit of separating cultures into sealed boxes fails completely here. The map survives from a world in motion, where information moves even when people are at war. There is another reason the Piri Reis map unsettles the mind. It appears at a moment when reality itself is outrunning inherited imagination. For centuries, educated geography in Europe and the Islamic world has drawn from ancient authorities, especially Ptolemy, whose works described a world of known lands encircled by assumptions and mathematical structure. Those ancient frameworks are not useless. They are sophisticated, influential, and often brilliant. But by the late 15th and early 16th centuries, ships are bringing back information that strains them. Africa is not shaped exactly as expected. The Indian Ocean is open, not enclosed. Across the Atlantic lies land that cannot easily be fitted into old models. The world is not merely bigger, it is different. In that sense, the map is a record of shock. Not the sudden shock of one person gasping over a discovery, but the slower shock of civilizations adjusting their mental maps. Every coastline on it carries a tension between what is known and what is guessed. Some parts are inherited from long-tested navigation. Others are fresh, unstable, almost trembling with uncertainty. This is what makes it feel alive. It is a map drawn before the world has settled into certainty. And yet, there is something deeply fragile about it. Only a fragment survives. The missing portions may have answered questions that now seem unanswerable. They may also have created new ones. The surviving sheet is damaged, and damage invites imagination. What is torn away becomes almost as important as what remains. The mind completes the missing world. It fills gaps with secret archives, lost voyages, ancient astronomers, vanished coastal surveys, or civilizations drowned before history began. Scholars still debate details of the map's sources and interpretations, but the wider lesson is clear absence is never empty. In history, absence is active. It shapes what people believe. The ancient map that shows a world that should not exist is therefore not one mystery but several. There is the surface mystery, the one that draws the eye's strange coastlines, unexpected lands, possible hidden knowledge. Beneath that is the historical mystery, how geographic information moved through empires at a time when maps could be state secrets. Beneath that is the psychological mystery, why modern people hunger for signs that the past was hiding something enormous. And beneath all of it is the oldest mystery of maps themselves, how a flat surface can make human beings believe they possess the world, even when the world remains unfinished, dangerous, and only partly known. The Piri Reis map is not the beginning of mapping, and it is not the end of the story. It is a doorway. Through it, one enters a much older human effort to turn experience into shape. Long before satellites, before global surveys, before longitude could be measured reliably at sea, people were already drawing rivers, coasts, roads, stars, sacred centres, trading routes, and imagined edges. Some maps were practical, Some were symbolic, some were political. Some were attempts to preserve the memory of travel through landscapes that could kill the unwary. To see why one torn map from 1513 could seem so impossible, it is necessary to step back into a world before measurement, when geography was not yet a science of certainty, but a living art of survival, power, memory, and belief. Long before the world could be measured with instruments, it had to be remembered. A coastline was not first understood as a clean black line surrounding a coloured continent. It was a sequence of dangers and signs, a headland shaped like an animal's back, a reef that broke white under certain winds, a river mouth where the water changed colour, a harbour entered only by those who knew which star to follow and which current to fear. Geography began not as an image of the planet from above, but as a body of lived knowledge carried in speech, habit, ritual, trade, and repetition. People knew the world by moving through it, and the earliest maps were only one way of catching that movement before it disappeared. This is why ancient and medieval geography can feel so strange to modern eyes. Modern people are trained to expect maps to behave like accurate pictures. A map is assumed to be a scaled, measurable surface, corrected by satellites and coordinates, with north at the top and coastlines fixed by remote sensing. But for most of human history, a map did not need to do all of that. It might show a route rather than a territory. It might enlarge a sacred city and shrink an entire sea. It might place important places close together because they mattered, not because they were near. It might preserve the order of ports along a voyage while distorting the actual shape of the coast. It might be wonderfully useful and visually wrong at the same time. This older way of mapping is essential to understanding why an artifact like the Piri Reis map can seem impossible. When modern viewers notice a familiar coastline in an old chart, they are tempted to measure it against the whole globe at once. They look for Antarctica, Brazil, Africa, the Caribbean, and a hidden system behind them all. But the people who made such maps often worked from fragments a sailor's account, a portolan chart, an inherited classical text, a rumour from a merchant, a captured document, a copied outline whose original purpose had already been forgotten. The result could look astonishingly advanced in one corner and deeply confused in another. That is not a contradiction. It is exactly what one should expect from a world where knowledge travels unevenly. The first map makers were not necessarily trying to answer the same question modern maps answer. A Babylonian clay tablet from the first millennium BCE, often called the Babylonian map of the world, does not give a practical chart of the whole earth in the modern sense. It places Babylon near the centre and surrounds the known world with a circular ocean, beyond which lie distant regions described in mythic or symbolic language. It is a vision of order as much as space. It tells us how a culture imagined its place in existence. It does not fail because it is not satellite imagery. It succeeds because it reveals a worldview. Other ancient maps were more practical. Egyptian surveyors had to restore field boundaries after the Nile flood. Roman administrators needed roads, provinces, military routes, and distances. Greek thinkers tried to calculate the size of the earth, divide it into zones, and place cities by latitude. The great surprise, still powerful today, is that ancient geography could be remarkably sophisticated without being globally complete. Eratosthenes, working in the 3rd century BCE, estimated the circumference of the Earth with impressive reasoning, using shadows, angles, and distance. Hipparchus and later Ptolemy developed systems of coordinates. Mariners accumulated detailed knowledge of coasts and winds. Yet none of this meant that the whole planet was accurately mapped. Intelligence does not remove limitation. A brilliant method still depends on the data available to it. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that ancient people lived with multiple geographies at once. There was the mathematical geography of scholars, the practical geography of sailors, the sacred geography of temples, the political geography of rulers, and the remembered geography of ordinary movement. These did not always agree. A merchant might know a route across desert stations better than a scholar knew the desert on a map. A fisherman might know currents more accurately than a court geographer. A monk copying a text might preserve a place name long after the place itself had changed hands, declined, or vanished. The world existed in pieces, and those pieces were stored in different mines. The sea made this even more complicated. Land routes leave traces, roads cut into earth, settlements accumulate debris, rivers guide movement, but the sea erases passage almost instantly. A ship crosses, and the wake closes behind it. Maritime knowledge has to be preserved through memory, instruments, repeated voyages, and charts that are often guarded because they are valuable. A wrong line on land may inconvenience a traveller. A wrong line at sea can kill a crew. This is why navigational knowledge often became practical, secretive, and conservative. Sailors trusted what worked. They copied coastal sequences, compass directions, distances, and safe anchorages. If a chart brought ships home, it had value, even if its larger geometry was imperfect. By the late medieval period, Mediterranean sailors were using Portolan charts, and these are among the most beautiful and puzzling maps ever made. They show coastlines of the Mediterranean and Black Sea with a precision that still startles historians. Their networks of rum lines radiate from compass roses, not because they are decorative, but because they help pilots follow bearings across water. The outlines of familiar seas appear far more accurate than many older world maps. Yet their origins are still debated. Scholars still debate exactly how Portolan chart makers achieved their accuracy, how much came from compass navigation, how much from accumulated sailing directions, and how the earliest examples emerged so suddenly in the surviving record. No single explanation fully accounts for every feature, but there is no need to imagine impossible technology. Repeated maritime experience, carefully copied, can be powerful. That is one of the hidden lessons behind the Piri Reis map. The world does not need to be fully known for parts of it to be known very well. A sailor can know the coast from Lisbon to West Africa with deadly seriousness, while knowing almost nothing of inland Africa. Portuguese pilots could gradually build a strong practical picture of Atlantic shores through repeated voyages, each voyage extending the edge of the last, Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay. And Chinese navigators had their own deep maritime traditions in other waters. Knowledge did not spread equally across all societies or seas, but wherever people moved often enough, they produced patterns, and patterns could become maps. Still, early maps did more than guide travel. They served power. To draw a map was to claim the ability to see from above, to organize land, to imagine ownership, taxation, conquest, conversion, or defense. Rulers wanted maps because maps turned uncertainty into something administrable. Even when inaccurate, they gave the impression of grasp. An empire can rule only what it can describe, or at least what it believes it can describe. In this sense, a map is never innocent. It is a tool of memory, but also a tool of ambition. The period around 1500 intensifies all of this. Sea routes are no longer only local or regional. They're becoming global in consequence, even if not yet global in understanding. Portuguese ships push around Africa, Spanish voyages cross the Atlantic, Ottoman power spans the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, the Red Sea, and beyond. Italian merchants and cartographers act as brokers of information. Islamic scholars inherit and transform Greek, Persian, Indian, and Arabic geographic traditions. Jewish, Genoese, Catalan, Arab, Greek, and Turkish intermediaries move through ports where language itself becomes a navigational instrument. A map from this age may contain information gathered across religious and political boundaries, even when those boundaries are violently defended. This helps explain why the Piri Reis map feels like it belongs to more than one world. It is not simply Ottoman, though it is proudly signed by an Ottoman admiral. It is not simply European, though it preserves information from European Atlantic voyages. It is not simply ancient, though it may echo older geographic traditions. It is not simply modern, though it participates in the birth of modern global mapping. It is a hybrid object from a hybrid age, made when old authorities still mattered and new discoveries could not be ignored. The temptation is to imagine that if a map contains surprising knowledge, its source must be equally surprising. Sometimes that is true. More often, the route is messier. Knowledge can arrive through captured ships, diplomatic gifts, stolen charts, oral testimony, commercial exchange, and imperfect copying. A sailor taken prisoner might reveal a coastline. A pilot might sell information. A mapmaker might combine two charts with different scales and create a shape that later looks mysterious. A place drawn from direct experience might sit beside a place drawn from hearsay. Errors are not merely failures, they are fingerprints of transmission. This is why the world before measurement was not a world without knowledge. It was a world with different kinds of knowledge, each bound to its method of survival. A star path remembered by Pacific navigators, a desert itinerary kept by caravan traders, a monsoon route known in the Indian Ocean, a Mediterranean portolan chart, a Roman road list, a monk's mappa mundi, a scholar's coordinate table. All of these belong to geography, but they do not produce the same image. They answer different needs, they carry different assumptions, they preserve different truths. The Piri Reis map emerges from this long human struggle to make the world visible. Its strangeness is not only in what it may show, but in what modern viewers expect it to show. They expect one map to have one logic, but early maps often have several logics layered together. A coastline may come from sailors, an island may come from legend, a note may come from a book, a southern land may come from theory, a name may come from politics, a distortion may come from forcing curved experience onto flat skin. The map becomes a meeting place for facts, errors, memories, hopes, and inherited authority. And once this is understood, the mystery changes shape. The impossible map is not impossible because ancient people lacked intelligence. They did not. It is not impossible because old societies were isolated. They were not. It seems impossible because modern certainty has made people forget how knowledge used to move slowly in some places, suddenly in others, guarded in one port, traded in another, damaged by copying, sharpened by practice, distorted by belief, and sometimes preserved by chance. A world before measurement could still produce moments of astonishing clarity. It could also produce shadows that later generations mistake for hidden continents. The torn map under glass is therefore only one surviving witness to a much older process. Behind it stand countless lost sketches, sea charts, route lists, spoken instructions, pilot books, harbour memories, and geographic traditions that never reached a modern archive. Some were used until they wore out, some burned, some sank with ships, some were copied into later works and then forgotten. What remains is fragmentary. But fragments are enough to show that the making of the world on paper was never a single invention. It was an accumulation. And by the time Piri Reis took up his sources in the early 16th century, that accumulation had already been building for thousands of years, waiting to be gathered into a map that would one day make people wonder whether the past had seen more than it should. By the time Piri Reis draws his map, he is not standing at the beginning of geographic knowledge. He is standing in a room filled with ghosts. Some of those ghosts are named Ptolemy, Strabo, Al-Idrisi, Marino of Tyre, men whose writings or reputations move across centuries with the authority of old light. Others are nameless pilots who memorized dangerous coasts, scribes who copied place names they had never seen, merchants who described islands to men with ink-stained hands, sailors who returned from storms with one new cape fixed in memory. A map like the one Piri Reis makes is not created from nothing. It is assembled from fragments, and every fragment has already survived its own journey. This is one of the least dramatic but most important truths about old maps. Many of them are copies of copies, or compilations of compilations, and their deepest sources often vanish long before the surviving version is made. What remains in an archive may look like the beginning of a tradition simply because everything earlier has disappeared. A chart dated to one century may preserve information gathered in another. A manuscript copied by a medieval scholar may carry an ancient coastline. A Roman distance, a Greek coordinate, an Arab correction, and a local misunderstanding all in the same passage. The surface is young. The layers beneath it are older. This layered quality is what gives early cartography its strange afterlife. A modern viewer sees a map and wants to ask whether it is accurate or inaccurate, advanced or primitive, true or false. But older maps resist such clean judgment. They can preserve a remarkably good outline of one region while placing another in a fog of inherited error. They can transmit real discoveries inside frameworks that are no longer believed. They can keep the name of a place long after the political world that named it is gone. They can also fossilize mistakes. A coast once drawn too far east may be copied so many times that the error becomes tradition. A speculative island may live on for centuries because removing it feels riskier than leaving it there. To understand Piri Reis, one must understand this culture of inheritance. He's not simply drawing what he personally knows. He's entering a conversation already centuries old. Some of that conversation comes through the Islamic world, whose scholars did not merely preserve Greek geography but expanded, criticized, translated, corrected, and reimagined it. Under Abbasid patronage, scholars in Baghdad translated works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit, and Syriac. They studied astronomy, mathematics, navigation, and the measurement of the earth. Geographers described climates, roads, seas, provinces, peoples, trade routes, and marvels. Their works were not uniform, and they were not all accurate, but they formed a vast intellectual landscape in which geography was tied to empire, faith, commerce, and curiosity. One of the great names in this tradition is Al-Idrisi, working in the 12th century at the court of Roger II of Sicily, a Norman king ruling a Mediterranean kingdom shaped by Latin, Greek, and Arab influences. Al-Idrisi's great geographical work, accompanied by a world map and regional maps, is a reminder that knowledge did not obey simple civilizational borders. Sicily, sitting between worlds, became a place where Arabic scholarship and European power could meet. Al-Idrisi gathered reports from travellers, earlier texts, merchants, and informants. His world was not a modern world map, but it was ambitious, systematic, and deeply connected to the lived geography of trade. What survives in the record suggests that such works mattered not only because they mapped space, but because they gathered testimony. Testimony is fragile. A traveller's description can be precise or exaggerated. A merchant may know distances in days rather than miles. A sailor may describe currents better than coasts. A scholar may force a new report into an old framework, because the old framework still carries authority. Yet without testimony, much of the world remains blank. Before large-scale instrument surveying, geography depends on trust. The mapmaker must decide which voices to believe, which old source to correct, which rumour to include, and which impossibility to leave outside the border. This decision-making rarely survives in detail. We see the finished map, not the hesitation behind it. The Mediterranean world was especially rich in such exchanges. Ports were not merely places where goods moved, they were places where information changed hands. A cargo of grain, cloth, timber, spices, or slaves might travel with news of a war, a harbour, a pirate fleet, a newly fortified island, a river mouth, a reef, a royal marriage, a plague, or a distant voyage. Captains carried practical knowledge because their lives depended on it. Merchants carried geographic knowledge because profit depended on it. States sought such knowledge because power depended on it. Even when rulers tried to keep charts secret, the sea itself worked against secrecy. Ships were captured, crews defected, pilots were hired away, prisoners talked, copies were made. The Iberian Atlantic added a new urgency. As Portuguese sailors moved down the coast of Africa in the 15th century, they gradually transformed European knowledge of the ocean. This was not a single heroic leap, but a long, difficult accumulation, cape after cape, river after river, wind pattern after wind pattern. The Atlantic was not empty. It had islands, currents, seasonal systems, and terrifying distances. The Portuguese learned that returning north from West Africa was not simply a matter of sailing back along the same coast. The winds and currents demanded a wide swing into the ocean, a technique that helped reveal the Atlantic as a system rather than a blank expanse. This kind of knowledge does not always look spectacular on a map, but it changes history. Spain's westward voyages then added a shock of a different kind. Lands appeared where old geography had no comfortable place for them. At first, many Europeans struggled to understand what had been found. Were these islands near Asia, a new continent, a barrier, a chain of lands, a coast of something already known under another name? The earliest maps of the Americas are full of uncertainty, because the concept of the Americas had not yet stabilized. Coastlines arrived before continents. Names arrived before understanding. Claims arrived before comprehension. That is why a map from 1513 can look both advanced and confused. The Atlantic world is being assembled faster than theory can absorb it. Piri Reis tells us that he used multiple sources, including charts associated with Columbus. This claim has attracted enormous attention because Columbus's own map materials are mostly lost. If Piri had access, directly or indirectly, to a Columbian chart, then his map may preserve traces of one of the most consequential lost cartographic traditions in history. But here, caution is necessary. Scholars still debate exactly what Piri meant, what kind of chart he possessed. and how faithfully any Columbian material survived through copying, the evidence remains incomplete. It is possible that he used a chart based on Spanish discoveries connected to Columbus and his successors, rather than a map literally drawn by Columbus's own hand. The distinction matters, but either way, the implication is remarkable geographic intelligence from the Spanish Atlantic somehow reached an Ottoman admiral. That movement of information should not surprise us as much as it often does. The early modern world was violent, competitive, and interconnected. Ottoman naval commanders had reason to study European charts. European powers had reason to conceal them. North African corsairs, Mediterranean traders, renegade sailors, diplomats, captives, and spies formed a dense human web through which information could pass. A map might cross a frontier more easily than an army. A coastline discovered in the service of one king could end up copied in the service of another sultan. Knowledge was valuable precisely because it could move. Fragments of older knowledge also survived through books. Ptolemy's geography, revived in Europe during the Renaissance through Greek manuscripts and Latin translations, offered a coordinate-based vision of the world that shaped map-making profoundly. Yet Ptolemy's data had limits and errors, some of them enormous. His estimate of the Earth's circumference was too small, and his arrangement of longitudes helped create a world in which Asia seemed reachable by sailing west across a narrower ocean. This mattered. Old errors could help make new voyages seem plausible. The ancient map did not merely preserve knowledge, it could encourage risk. In the Islamic world, Ptolemaic geography was known, debated, and joined with other traditions. Astronomers refined measurements, geographers described regions beyond the Mediterranean, navigators in the Indian Ocean used monsoon knowledge, stars, and sailing instructions to cross vast distances long before European expansion into those waters. Chinese cartographic traditions developed in different forms, often administrative and terrestrial, rather than Mediterranean-style nautical. None of these traditions produced a single secret perfect world map. That is important. The evidence does not support the idea of one hidden ancient atlas accurately showing all continents, but it does support something more subtle and historically powerful. Different societies possess deep, specialized knowledge of different regions, and pieces of that knowledge sometimes crossed cultural boundaries. The problem is that survival is uneven. A library burns, and a tradition appears smaller than it was. A ship sinks, and a chart disappears. A palace archive is looted, and a bureaucratic memory dies. Paper decays. Parchment is scraped and reused. Political change can turn useful records into forgotten debris. When modern historians look backward, they are not seeing the full body of past knowledge. They are seeing what escaped destruction. That surviving fraction can mislead in both directions. It can make ancient knowledge seem poorer than it was because so much is missing. It can also make a surviving artifact seem impossibly advanced because the intermediate steps have vanished. The Piri race map stands exactly in this gap. It is not that it must come from a lost civilization, it is that it comes from lost sources. That is enough to make it mysterious. Somewhere behind it were charts, sketches, reports, and compilations that no longer exist. Some may have been quite recent. Some may have carried older coastlines. Some may have been copied from Portuguese or Spanish materials. Some may have drawn from Mediterranean Portolan traditions. Some may have included educated guesses about unknown southern lands. Piri's genius, if that is the right word, was not that he possessed impossible knowledge. It was that he gathered fragments at a moment when fragments were changing the world. There is a lesser-known detail in this story that deserves attention. The Piri Reis map is only part of Piri's cartographic legacy. He later produced the Kitab-ul-Bahriyeh, the Book of Navigation, a detailed guide to the Mediterranean with maps, sailing directions, descriptions of coasts, ports, islands, hazards, and local conditions. This work shows him not as a mystical keeper of ancient secrets, but as a serious naval mind formed by practical seamanship. He understood that charts were tools. He understood coasts as lived spaces of danger and approach. He belonged to a professional world in which geographic knowledge had immediate consequences. A beautiful mistake could wreck a ship. A small accurate detail could save one. This matters because it brings the map back from fantasy into history without draining its wonder. The true miracle is not that Piri Reis somehow knew the ice-free coast of Antarctica. The true miracle is that a 16th century admiral in the Ottoman world could sit at the crossroads of so many streams of information and produce a map that still carries their traces. In its lines, one can sense Mediterranean pilots, Portuguese Atlantic exploration, Spanish discoveries, Islamic scholarship, classical inheritance, and the practical anxieties of empire. The map is not a voice from one lost world. It is a chorus from many half-lost worlds. And this is why old maps can be more haunting than ruins. A ruined city shows that people once built walls, streets, temples, markets, and homes. A map shows that they imagined relationships beyond what they could see. It shows the mind reaching outward. It reveals not just where people had been, but where they believed the world continued. It preserves confidence and confusion together. It records the boundary between knowledge and guesswork at a specific historical moment. And that boundary is often where mystery lives. So when the torn map seems to show a world that should not exist, the first answer is not that history must be overturned. The first answer is that history is made of transmission, and transmission is rarely clean. A coastline may pass through enemies. A name may outlive an empire. A sailor's memory may enter a scholar's diagram. A classical error may steer a Renaissance voyage. A copied fragment may preserve the only trace of a lost source. By the time those pieces reach Piri Reis, they have already travelled farther than many ships. The map in the dust is therefore not a single revelation. It is an accumulation of survivals. To follow it properly, one has to move closer to the artifact itself, to the gazelle skin, the ink, the inscriptions, the Atlantic coasts, and the admiral who signed his name in a world where maps were not merely descriptions of space, but weapons, trophies, secrets, and promises. The surviving fragment of the Piri Reis map does not announce itself like a treasure. It is not a complete atlas resting in perfect condition, not a grand imperial chart spread wide enough to command a room. It is damaged, partial, and strangely intimate. The skin on which it is drawn has darkened with time. The missing portions leave the eye feeling cheated, as if the answer to the whole mystery may have been cut away centuries ago by accident, neglect, or reuse. Yet the fragment that remains is enough. It carries the western edge of Africa, parts of Europe, islands in the Atlantic, the eastern outline of South America, and a dense web of notes that make the map more than an image. It is a document speaking about its own making, and that is rare enough to matter. Piri Reis was not a scholar hidden away from the sea. He was a man of ships, war, coastlines, and imperial struggle. Born around the second half of the 15th century, likely in Gallipoli, he grew up in a place shaped by the Ottoman navy and the wider violence of the Mediterranean. His uncle, Kemal Reis, was a famous seaman and corsair who later entered Ottoman service, and Peary learned in a world where navigation was not abstract. The sea was a battlefield, a road, a hunting ground, and a political frontier. To know it was to survive it. To map it was to make power visible. By 1513, when the famous map is made, the Ottoman Empire is one of the great forces of the age. Its armies and fleets press across southeastern Europe, the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Red Sea world. Istanbul, once Constantinople, is no longer simply the capital of a conquered empire. It is a centre of imperial ambition, administration, scholarship, and collection. Maps, manuscripts, reports, and captured knowledge matter there. The Ottomans are not watching the age of exploration from a distant corner. They are part of the same connected world, even when their interests and routes differ from those of Portugal and Spain. The map's own inscriptions say that Peary drew it in Gallipoli and presented it to Sultan Selim I. This detail gives the object a political setting. A map presented to a ruler is not merely a curiosity. It is a tool of awareness, a statement that the empire can see beyond its immediate waters. It says that the Atlantic discoveries of Christian powers are not invisible to Ottoman eyes. It gathers enemy knowledge and folds it into an Ottoman frame. In an age when geography and empire are becoming inseparable, such an act has weight. What makes the map even more intriguing is that Peary tells us he used about 20 charts and mappe mundi, along with other sources. Among them, he mentions maps from the time of Alexander, Arab maps, Portuguese maps, and a map associated with Columbus. The exact meaning of this list is still debated, and it should not be read too literally in every detail. Early modern authors often invoked ancient authorities to strengthen the prestige of their works. A reference to Alexander may point less to a surviving chart from Alexander's own hand and more to a tradition believed to be ancient. Still, the statement is extraordinary. Peary is openly presenting his map as a compilation, a woven object made from many strands. This is where the map becomes most historically alive. Its mystery is not that it drops from nowhere, but that it tells us, almost teasingly, that it came from elsewhere. It is a survivor of vanished sources. Peary had materials we do not have. He saw charts that are now lost. Some may have been crude, some may have been precious, some may have been copies of copies, some may have carried recent intelligence from voyages across the Atlantic. The evidence remains incomplete, but the map itself is proof that such material circulated farther than many modern assumptions once allowed. The Columbus connection is especially haunting. Columbus sailed in 1492, reached the Caribbean, and returned with claims that reshaped European politics. But his own geographical understanding was famously tangled. He believed, or insisted, that he had reached lands connected to Asia. His voyages produced charts, reports, and rumours, but much of the earliest cartographic record of his discoveries has vanished. If Peary's map truly preserves information derived from Columbian materials, then the torn Ottoman fragment may be one of the few indirect echoes of maps used in the first generation of Atlantic encounter. That alone would make it priceless. Even without Antarctica, even without lost civilizations, even without any impossible claim. The map's notes include stories of discovery, descriptions of lands, references to people, animals, and islands, and explanations of where certain information came from. Some are practical, others are fanciful or second-hand. This mixture is important. It shows that Peary was not only copying coastlines, but also preserving narratives attached to them. Early maps often did this. They did not separate geography cleanly from ethnography, rumour, natural history, and political report. The unknown world was not simply measured, it was described, imagined, feared, and interpreted. A coastline could come with a story, an island could carry a warning. A new land could be filled with details that were partly observed, partly misunderstood, and partly inherited from old expectations about the edges of the world. The visual structure of the map reveals its nautical heritage. It uses compass roses and rum lines in the Portolan tradition, the network of directional lines that allowed navigators to work with bearings across the sea. The Mediterranean world had long produced such charts, and their practical accuracy in familiar waters could be remarkable. But the Peary Race map applies this tradition to a widening Atlantic. It is an old technique stretched across new knowledge. That stretching creates both power and distortion. It lets the map bring distant coasts into relationship, but it also warps them, compresses them, and sometimes turns uncertainty into confident line work. A striking detail is that the map is not oriented in the way modern viewers automatically expect. Early maps did not always place north at the top, and Portolan charts could be read according to their navigational use, rather than a fixed classroom convention. This alone can mislead modern interpretation. Turn a fragment, compare it to a modern projection, choose one coastline as the anchor, and suddenly another line may seem to match something dramatic. But the map was not built with modern projection standards. It is a handmade compilation from sources with different scales, orientations, and purposes. To force it too neatly onto a modern globe is to risk creating mysteries that belong more to the interpreter than to the artifact. And yet, even after caution, the map remains impressive. The Atlantic coast of Africa is recognizable. The bulge of eastern South America appears with enough confidence to show that substantial information about Portuguese exploration had entered the mapmaker's world. Islands appear, some known, some misplaced, some perhaps duplicated or confused. The Caribbean is there in distorted form, though its arrangement is far from modern accuracy. The map does not give us a perfect world. It gives us a world in the act of being learned. That phrase matters in the act of being learned. The Peary Race map is not a settled statement. It is a snapshot of transition. It belongs to a moment when new continents are not yet fully conceptualized, when South America is still being traced in segments, when the Caribbean is a cluster of reports, when the Pacific has not yet entered European mapping in its full significance, and when the southern limits of the Atlantic world remain open to speculation. This makes the map feel unstable, but instability is its historical truth. The famous lower coastline, the one later writers would connect to Antarctica, sits within this instability. It stretches from South America in a way that seems strange to modern eyes. Some have seen in it an impossible southern continent. Others see a continuation or duplication of the South American coast, bent eastward by the logic of the map's sources and the limitations of its projection. Mainstream scholarship favours explanations rooted in early 16th century cartographic practice, not ancient global surveying. Still, it is understandable why the shape has attracted so much attention. A torn fragment invites completion. A curved southern land invites speculation. A map already connected with lost sources becomes fertile ground for grand theories. Peary himself, however, does not present the map as a relic of a vanished superscience. He presents it as a compilation of available knowledge, some old, some new, some reliable, some not. That may sound less dramatic, but in reality it is more revealing. The map shows how knowledge was made before modern scientific standardization, through gathering, comparison, authority, practical experience, and sometimes bold guesswork. It shows an Ottoman admiral trying to bring order to a flood of geographic information pouring out of the Atlantic. In that sense, he was facing the same problem as every serious mapmaker of his age. The world had changed faster than the maps. There is a quiet human tension in this. Piri Reis lived in a time when the old Mediterranean centre of gravity was being challenged by oceanic routes. The Portuguese path around Africa threatened older trade systems. Spanish expansion across the Atlantic opened lands and violences on a scale still difficult to comprehend. The Ottomans remained immensely powerful, but geography itself was shifting. A map of the Atlantic was not only about distant coasts, it was about the future of empire. It was about where wealth might flow, where rivals might grow strong, where wars might eventually reach. To draw the Atlantic was to admit that the world had widened. The map also reminds us that discovery is rarely as clean as later stories make it seem. The old heroic version imagines one explorer, one voyage, one revelation, one blank filled in. The real process is more tangled. Indigenous peoples already knew the lands Europeans were claiming to discover. Mariners saw coasts in fragments. Reports contradicted one another. Mapmakers drew what they could. Empires converted uncertain knowledge into confident claims. Errors hardened into policy. Violence followed lines on paper. The Piri Reis map exists inside that uncomfortable history. Its beauty cannot be separated from the world of conquest and rivalry that produced it. Still, there is something moving about the object itself. It survived when so much did not. The maps Piri used are largely gone. The full chart of which this fragment was part is gone. The working conversations behind it are gone. The hands that copied, carried, folded, stored, and perhaps forgot it are gone. Yet this torn piece remains, carrying enough information to disturb certainty. It is a survivor not only of time, but of selection. Most documents die ordinary deaths. This one happened to live, and because it lived, it became something its maker could not have predicted. For Piri Reis, the map was likely a serious work of compilation and presentation, a useful and prestigious chart for an imperial world. For modern viewers, it became an enigma, a stage onto which hopes about lost knowledge could be projected. The same lines that once expressed navigational intelligence became evidence, for some, of ancient catastrophe, ice-free Antarctica, forgotten civilizations, or secrets hidden by academic caution. The map did not change. The questions around it did. That is why the Piri Reis enigma begins not with Antarctica, but with the fragment itself damaged, layered, practical, political, and alive with borrowed knowledge. Before asking whether it shows a world that should not exist, one has to ask what world it was actually made in. That world was not ignorant. It was not modern. It was neither simple nor sealed. It was a world where sailors carried coastlines in memory. Empires hunted for charts. Scholars trusted ancient authorities while correcting them, and mapmakers tried to stitch together a planet whose edges kept moving. On that torn skin, one can still see the stitching. The first thing that makes the Piri Reis map feel uncanny is not its most controversial line. It is the fact that so much of it is recognizable at all. The eye drifts across the eastern Atlantic and finds shapes that belong to the real world. The western coast of Africa descends in a long, familiar sweep. The Atlantic islands are scattered across the sea, to the west, beyond the ocean. Another coast appears, not as a vague medieval rumour, but as a forceful presence. South America bends down the page with enough certainty to remind the viewer that this map was made after ships had already begun tearing open the old limits of geography. It is not a fantasy map. It is not merely symbolic. It is trying, seriously and ambitiously, to describe the Earth. That seriousness is what gives its errors such power. A completely imaginary map is easy to dismiss. A nearly perfect map would be easy to explain if it belonged to a later age. But the Piri Reis map lives in between. It is accurate enough to impress, wrong enough to disturb, and early enough to make every recognizable coastline feel like a clue. In it, the world appears half-revealed, as if emerging from fog. Some shores are drawn with confidence, others drift, bend, duplicate, or blur into speculation. The result is not the clean certainty of modern cartography, but the restless intelligence of a mapmaker working with uneven evidence. The African coast is one of the map's strongest anchors. By the early 16th century, Portuguese voyages had transformed knowledge of Africa's Atlantic outline. For generations, European and Mediterranean geographers had inherited partial and often mistaken ideas about the continent's western edge. But Portuguese navigators had moved progressively south, rounding capes, naming rivers, recording harbours, learning winds, and eventually reaching the Cape of Good Hope in the late 15th century. By the time Piri Reis compiled his map, the outline of Western Africa was no longer a mere classical inheritance. It had been tested by repeated sailing. That practical experience shows. Yet even here, the map is not simply modern. Coastlines on Portoland-style charts often preserve navigational relationships better than geometric accuracy. Distances may compress, angles may shift. A coastline may look convincing in sequence while failing when forced onto a modern projection. This is why comparisons between the Piri Reis map and satellite outlines can be misleading. If one stretches, rotates, and overlays fragments long enough, resemblances begin to appear that the original maker never intended. The map's recognizable Africa matters, but it must be read as 16th century cartography, not as a hidden photograph from space. The Atlantic islands deepen the sense of a world being assembled from practical roots. The Canaries, Madeira, the Azores, and Cape Verde Islands had become crucial stepping stones in Atlantic navigation and empire. They were not merely dots, they were staging grounds, experiments in colonization, sugar production, enslavement, resupply, and oceanic movement. Their placement on maps reflected the growing importance of the Atlantic not as an empty obstacle, but as a navigable system. Winds, currents, and islands turned the ocean into a connected space. What survives in the map suggests a world increasingly shaped by sailors who knew how to move through it, even if they did not yet fully understand its global structure. Then comes the western side, where the map's mystery sharpens. The coast of South America appears surprisingly prominent. Its eastern bulge, corresponding broadly to Brazil, had entered European knowledge after Portuguese voyages around 1500, especially the expedition associated with Pedro Álvares Cabral and subsequent explorations. By 1513, enough information had circulated for a mapmaker with access to Portuguese or derivative charts to show a substantial part of that coast. This is not impossible. It is historically plausible, but it remains impressive because of the speed. Barely more than a decade after the first official Portuguese landfall in Brazil, an Ottoman mapmaker could incorporate its outline into a world chart. That speed tells us something important about the movement of knowledge. Secrets leak, charts travel, empires watch one another. The coast is not perfect. It stretches, bends, and carries uncertainties. Some areas seem to reflect real information from voyages. Others appear confused or speculative. In the early years of Atlantic mapping, South America was not yet a fully understood continent in European or Ottoman eyes. It was a series of shores, reports, and claims. Mapmakers often had coastal segments without a clear sense of how they joined. A coastline could be extended beyond observation because mapmakers expected land to continue. Features could be duplicated if the same report entered through different sources. A river mouth might be misplaced, a cape might be exaggerated. Such mistakes are not embarrassing leftovers. They are evidence of the process. This is especially important when considering the map's southern extension. On the Piri Reis fragment, the South American coast appears to turn eastward along the bottom of the surviving sheet. To some modern interpreters, this has seemed too strange to be merely South America. They have argued that it represents Antarctica, drawn before its official discovery and perhaps before it was covered by ice. But when the map is read in its own cartographic context, the more cautious explanation is that the line reflects a distorted, continued, or misunderstood version of southern South America, possibly combined with assumptions about unknown southern lands. Scholars still debate specific details, but the evidence does not require an ice-free Antarctic coastline. The shape may be mysterious, but mystery is not the same as impossibility. One of the lesser-known details in this debate is that early maps often bent coastlines to fit available space, inherited formats, or theoretical expectations. A mapmaker did not always leave a coast unfinished simply because exploration had ended. Blankness itself could feel like a problem. If reports suggested land continued south, the map might continue it. If older ideas suggested a southern land balancing the northern continents, that expectation could shape how unknown regions were drawn. The idea of a great southern land, later called Terra Australis in many European traditions, existed long before Antarctica was actually seen. It came from philosophical and geographical reasoning, not direct observation. A southern land on an old map is therefore not automatically evidence that anyone had been there. The Caribbean portion of the map also reveals the unstable early understanding of the Atlantic world. The islands associated with Columbus's voyages appear, but not in a way that would satisfy a modern atlas. Some are misplaced, some may be confused with parts of Asia, reflecting Columbus's own mistaken belief that he had reached the Indies near the eastern edge of the known world. If Piri Reis used a Columbus-related source, he may have inherited not only information but also misconception. This is a crucial point. Lost sources are not necessarily accurate sources. A vanished chart can preserve error just as easily as truth. The map's notes reinforce this mixture. They describe discoveries and lands with confidence in some places and uncertainty in others. They carry the flavour of second-hand information, of reports transformed by distance. Early accounts of the Americas often blended observation with expectation. Europeans arriving in the Caribbean and along the American coasts interpreted what they saw through older frameworks about Asia. Islands of wealth, strange peoples, monstrous races, and biblical or classical geography. Some details were real, others were distorted by misunderstanding or desire. A map could absorb that blend and make it look authoritative. This is where the map becomes more than a geographic artifact. It becomes a record of contact before comprehension. The Atlantic world had entered imperial knowledge faster than it had entered stable understanding. Sailors were seeing coastlines, but states were still arguing over what those coastlines meant. Were they islands, mainland Asia, a new world, a barrier to Asia, a source of gold, labour, souls, spices, timber, or strategic advantage? The map does not answer all of this cleanly. It preserves the confusion. The recognizable features therefore should not be separated from the errors. Together, they reveal the map's historical truth. Africa is relatively strong because its Atlantic coast had been learned through repeated voyages. Brazil appears because recent Portuguese knowledge had circulated. The Caribbean is distorted because early Spanish discovery remained tangled with Columbus's assumptions and incomplete island mapping. The southern coastline is strange because exploration, speculation, and cartographic habit are meeting at the edge of the known. The map's power lies in this unevenness. Modern fascination often isolates the most dramatic claim, but the quieter details are just as revealing. For example, the map includes islands that may correspond to real Atlantic islands, but are positioned or shaped imperfectly. Such errors show that Peary's sources were not harmonized into a single measured framework. He likely had charts of different regions, perhaps drawn at different scales or based on different navigational systems, and he had to make them coexist. Anyone who has ever tried to combine conflicting maps without modern coordinate control can understand the difficulty. The result is not deception, it is compromise. There is also the matter of projection, though the word itself can make the subject sound colder than it is. A round Earth cannot be placed on a flat surface without distortion. Modern maps manage this with explicit mathematical systems, each sacrificing something area, shape, distance, or direction. Early mapmakers did not always use projections in a modern formal sense, especially when compiling Portolan-derived coastlines. They worked with practical orientations, bearings, distances, and inherited visual conventions. When modern analysts try to match such a map to a contemporary coordinate grid, the fit will always be imperfect. Sometimes the imperfection is meaningful. Sometimes it is simply the cost of comparing unlike systems. And yet there remains a real achievement here. The Peary race map is early, ambitious, and wide-ranging. It shows that the Ottoman intellectual and naval world was alert to Atlantic discoveries. It shows that information from Portuguese and Spanish exploration did not remain locked inside Iberian archives. It shows how quickly global geography was becoming a shared field of competition. This is perhaps the most important recognizable feature of all, not a coastline, but a historical pattern. The map proves that the new Atlantic world was already too large and too important to belong to one empire's secrecy. The map also shows how human beings make sense of novelty by attaching it to older structures. New coasts are drawn with old techniques. New lands are explained with inherited stories. New oceans are crossed using traditions built in older seas. Nothing appears in pure form. Even discovery is mediated by memory. When Peary Race draws the Atlantic, he is not drawing a modern ocean. He is drawing an ocean filtered through Mediterranean chart-making, Islamic geographic inheritance, Iberian exploration, sailor testimony, imperial rivalry, and the practical habits of a naval commander. That is why the map seems to breathe. It is full of motion. Ships have moved before it. Stories have moved into it. Errors have moved across copies. Coastlines have moved from experience into ink, and after its rediscovery, interpretations move outward again, turning the map into evidence for arguments Peary himself would likely not recognize. A coastline drawn under one set of assumptions becomes the foundation for another age's speculation. This is how artifacts acquire legends. They survive long enough to be misunderstood creatively. Still, the map deserves wonder. Not because it proves a lost civilization mapped the whole Earth, but because it captures a moment when the Earth was becoming harder to misunderstand. Each voyage narrowed the space available for inherited fantasy. Each new coast forced mapmakers to adjust. Each correction exposed another error. The world was resisting old diagrams. It was demanding to be redrawn. The coasts that look too familiar are therefore not proof that the past possessed impossible knowledge. They are proof that the past was more connected, more observant, and more capable than simple stories allow. Peary Race did not need satellites to know parts of the Atlantic. He needed sources, sailors, charts, and access to the currents of information moving through an age of expansion. The surprise is not that humans could gather such knowledge. The surprise is how fragile that gathering was, how easily its sources vanished, and how one torn fragment came to bear the weight of so many lost lines. At the bottom of the map, where the coast bends into controversy, the story becomes more dangerous. There, recognition gives way to desire. A shape becomes an argument. A distortion becomes a doorway. The viewer has to decide whether the map is showing a known land badly, an unknown land imagined, or something so extraordinary that it would force history to change. That decision has made the Peary Race map famous far beyond the world of cartography, and it is there, along the disputed southern edge, that the legend of Antarctica begins. The Antarctica claim begins with the temptation of shape, along the lower edge of the surviving Peary Race fragment. The coastline that seems to continue from South America bends eastward in a long, unexpected sweep. It does not behave the way a modern viewer expects the southern end of South America to behave. It seems too broad, too extended, too suggestive. Once someone proposes that this line might represent Antarctica, the eye begins to cooperate. The torn map becomes a secret. The strange curve becomes a hidden continent. The damage at the edge of the parchment becomes not a limitation, but an invitation. This is the most famous and most disputed idea attached to the map that Peary Rees somehow copied from ancient source maps showing Antarctica centuries before its official sighting, and even more dramatically, showing parts of it before they were covered by ice. In its strongest form, the theory suggests that a lost civilization, or an unknown ancient mapping tradition, surveyed the globe in remote antiquity and passed down its knowledge through copies until faint traces reach Peary Race in 1513. It is a powerful story because it offers more than a cartographic puzzle. It offers a hidden past. It suggests that history has forgotten a world capable of achievements we usually assign only to modern science. But the evidence does not carry that weight. Mainstream historians, cartographers, and geographers generally regard the Antarctica interpretation as unsupported. The southern land on the map is more plausibly read as a distorted continuation of South America, shaped by early 16th century information, inherited assumptions, and the practical problems of combining multiple charts. This does not mean every detail is simple. Scholars still debate aspects of the map's construction, source material, and coastline interpretation. Yet uncertainty in the details is not the same as proof of an impossible whole. No single explanation fully accounts for every oddity. But the leap to an ice-free Antarctica requires far more evidence than the map provides. The idea gained much of its modern fame in the 20th century, especially through writers who argued that the Peary Rees map preserved knowledge from an advanced prehistoric civilization. The claim was often linked to the work of Charles Hapgood, who believed that ancient maps contained evidence of a sophisticated global cartographic inheritance, and that Antarctica had once been mapped before its ice cover reached its present state. His ideas reached a wide audience partly because they appeared to offer a scholarly-looking alternative to conventional history. They were dramatic, detailed, and visually persuasive to readers who saw map comparisons without always seeing the assumptions behind them. But Hapgood's broader theories, including rapid crustal displacement and lost ancient surveyors, have not been accepted by mainstream science. One of the central problems is that Antarctica has been ice-covered for an extremely long time. Its ice sheet did not appear a few thousand years before Peri-Race. The East Antarctic ice sheet has existed for tens of millions of years in some form, while the West Antarctic ice sheet has varied more, but still belongs to deep geological timescales far beyond recorded human civilization. Coastal margins have changed, sea levels have risen and fallen, and parts of Antarctica's ice have advanced and retreated. But the notion that a human civilization mapped an ice-free Antarctic coastline in the recent ancient past does not align with geological evidence. The evidence remains incomplete in many fine details of paleoclimate, but not in a way that opens a simple path for an ice-free Antarctica known to ancient sailors. There is also a cartographic problem. To show Antarctica accurately, ancient source maps would have needed not only direct access to the continent, but also a level of global surveying, coordinate control, and preservation across millennia for which there is no archaeological evidence. A map can preserve surprising information, but information requires a chain. Where are the instruments, ports, texts, settlements, ships, and intermediate maps that would support such a tradition? Where is the broader material footprint of a civilization capable of mapping a frozen southern continent and transmitting that knowledge into classical, Islamic, medieval, and Ottoman cartography without leaving clearer traces? The unsupported theory asks one torn coastline to do the work of an entire missing world. The more grounded explanation begins with South America. In the early 16th century, its Atlantic coast was still being learned in sections. The southern end of the continent was not fully understood. The Strait of Magellan had not yet been crossed by Europeans when Peary drew his map. Mapmakers knew that land extended southward, but how far and in what shape remained uncertain. In such a setting, continuing the coastline beyond securely known information was not strange. A mapmaker might bend it, extend it, or merge it with assumptions about southern lands. The result could later look like something else, especially when examined as a fragment removed from its full original context. There is a subtle but important point here. Early mapmakers did not always mark uncertainty the way modern scientific maps might. They did not consistently use dotted lines, blank spaces, or cautionary labels to tell the viewer where direct knowledge ended and inference began. A guessed coast might be drawn with the same inked confidence as a known one. A duplicated report might become a new island. A theoretical land might be given a visual body. This can make old maps appear more certain than they were. The map does not always tell us where its maker stopped knowing and started imagining. The belief in a great southern land also matters. For centuries, many geographers imagined that a large landmass must exist in the southern hemisphere to balance the known lands of the north. This terra australis was not Antarctica as modern science knows it. It was a theoretical or speculative continent, a product of symmetry, philosophy, inherited geography, and the human tendency to complete patterns. As explorers gradually mapped the southern oceans, this imagined land changed shape, retreated, and eventually gave way to real southern geography. But in the 16th century, the idea of southern land could influence how unknown coasts were drawn. A strange southern coastline on a map does not automatically mean observation. It may mean expectation. The Peri-Race map's southern line may therefore be doing several things at once. It may continue the coast of Brazil and eastern South America beyond what was securely mapped. It may incorporate confused reports from voyages along the coast. It may be distorted by the map's compilation method. It may reflect the old tendency to fill unknown southern space with land. It may even preserve an error from a source map that Peary copied without fully resolving. These explanations are not as cinematic as lost Antarctic surveyors, but they are historically much stronger. They fit what is known about early modern mapping, exploration, and the circulation of imperfect information. There is also the danger of selective resemblance. When people compare the Peary Rays map to Antarctica, they often rotate, resize, or reinterpret parts of the map while ignoring mismatches elsewhere. A coastline that vaguely resembles one region under a chosen transformation may fail when tested against the full geography. Human perception is very good at finding patterns. A torn and distorted map gives pattern-seeking minds plenty to work with. This does not mean every resemblance is meaningless, but it means resemblance alone is weak evidence. The stronger question is not whether a line can be made to look familiar, but whether the historical chain required by that interpretation is supported. The Antarctica claim also depends on treating the map's accuracy as more uniform than it is. If the map were truly derived from a highly advanced ancient global survey, one might expect consistent precision across regions. Instead, the Peary Race fragment shows the unevenness typical of a compilation. Some areas are relatively strong, others are confused, islands shift, coastlines bend, the Caribbean is far from modern, the southern region is ambiguous. This unevenness points toward multiple sources of differing quality, not a single perfect ancient original. The map's mistakes are not obstacles to understanding it. They are among the best clues to what it really is. And yet, it is easy to understand why the Antarctica story survives. It gives the map a grandeur that ordinary history seems, at first, to deny. A distorted South American coastline is interesting. An Ottoman compilation of Iberian and Islamic sources is fascinating. But Antarctica before discovery feels like a revelation. It gives the viewer the sensation of standing before forbidden evidence. It turns parchment into a conspiracy against forgetfulness. It suggests that the world has been known, lost, and known again. That emotional force should not be underestimated. People are drawn to lost worlds because real history is full of losses, even when the specific lost world imagined is unsupported. There's a quieter way to honour that feeling without accepting the claim as fact. The map really does come from lost sources. It really does preserve vanished cartographic information. It really does show that knowledge moved across rival empires in ways that are still not fully documented. It really does remind us that the surviving record is only a fraction of what once existed. These truths are powerful enough. They do not require Antarctica. In fact, the Antarctica claim can distract from the deeper mystery by forcing the map into a yes or no argument about a single coastline, when the whole object is a testimony to the fragile movement of knowledge. The disputed southern edge is best seen not as a proof of impossible geography, but as a mirror of early modern uncertainty. There, the known coast of a newly encountered continent meets the inherited habit of completing the unknown. There, practical charting meets speculation. There, a mapmaker's confidence may conceal the weakness of his sources. And there, centuries later, modern imagination finds exactly the kind of gap it loves most, a place where the record is damaged. The line is strange, and the missing explanation can be made as large as a continent. The map does not need to show Antarctica to show a world that should not exist. It shows a world that should not exist only if one imagines the past as simple, isolated, and ignorant. But the past was not simple. The Ottoman admiral could know about Portuguese discoveries. Columbus's lost cartographic world could leave traces in Istanbul. Ancient authorities could still shape Renaissance geography. Sailors could carry practical information faster than official histories suggest. Errors could cross oceans. A torn fragment could outlive its sources and become more famous than the complete maps from which it was made. Still, the Antarctica claim forces a useful discipline. It asks us to distinguish wonder from evidence. It asks us to look closely at how maps are made, how coastlines are recognized, how theories grow, and how uncertainty can be inflated into certainty. It reminds us that the most seductive explanation is not always the strongest one, and it prepares the ground for a more careful question: if the southern coastline is not an ice-free Antarctic shore, then what exactly are we seeing? To answer that, the story must turn from legend to ice, from visual resemblance to geology, and from the dream of a lost continent to the stubborn physical history of the Earth itself. Ice changes the way the human mind imagines a place. A mountain under ice becomes a shape without a face. A continent under ice becomes almost unreal, not land in the ordinary sense, but silence given weight. Antarctica is not simply far away. It is hidden beneath itself. Its coastlines, mountains, valleys, and buried basins belong partly to geography and partly to deep time. Because what the eye sees from above is not the ground but the frozen memory of climates older than civilization. This is why the Antarctica claim attached to the Peary Race map feels so powerful. It is not only about a coastline. It is about the possibility that someone saw through the ice, or saw before the ice, and that a lost vision of the Earth survived in ink. But ice is not a curtain that appeared yesterday. It is a geological force with its own long history, and that history resists simple stories. Antarctica's ice sheets formed over millions of years through changes in climate, ocean circulation, atmospheric carbon dioxide, continental position, and the isolation of the southern polar region. The continent was once warmer in the very deep past. Forests existed there in earlier geological ages. Dinosaurs and later other life forms inhabited southern lands when the world was arranged differently. But that belongs to timescales so remote that no human mapmaker, no forgotten Bronze Age sailor, and no vanished civilization of the last few thousand years can be placed there. The evidence remains incomplete in many fine details, as all deep climate records are. But the broad reality is not uncertain enough to allow an ice-free Antarctica in the age of human cartography. This matters because the popular claim often depends on compressing time. It takes a true fact that Antarctica was not always icy and pulls it dangerously close to recorded history. But the Earth does not move at the pace of legend. Ice sheets grow, retreat, thicken, collapse, and stabilize over vast intervals. Sea levels rise and fall, glaciers grind rock into powder, shelves extend over water and break away. Buried landscapes can be detected with radar and geophysical surveys, revealing mountains, valleys, and ancient surfaces beneath the ice. These discoveries are genuinely astonishing. They show that Antarctica hides an older world, but they do not show that ancient navigators mapped it. The coastline itself is also more complicated than it seems. Modern people often imagine a coastline as a fixed edge, the place where land meets sea, yet coastlines move. They shift with sea level, erosion, sediment, uplift, subsidence, and ice. Around Antarctica, the visible edge can be the front of an ice shelf rather than exposed rock. In some places, the bedrock lies below sea level beneath thick ice. In others, the continent's true land margin differs dramatically from what a ship would see. To claim that a 16th century map shows the ice-free coast of Antarctica is therefore not merely to claim that someone saw the continent. It is to claim that someone had knowledge of a hidden bedrock geography that modern science required advanced surveying to reconstruct. That is an enormous claim, and extraordinary claims need more than a suggestive curve. When scholars examine the Piri-Reis map in relation to Antarctica, they do not find the consistent fit that the legend requires. The supposed Antarctic coastline is attached to South America rather than separated by the Drake Passage. Its proportions do not match Antarctica in a stable, convincing way. The interpretation often depends on choosing certain points as meaningful while explaining away others as distortion. But distortion cannot be used like a key that opens only the desired doors. If a map is distorted enough to make mismatches irrelevant, then resemblance loses much of its force. A shape can be made to echo many things when it's stretched across enough assumptions. There is another possibility that feels less dramatic but far more human. The southern line may be the result of accumulated coastal misunderstanding. Imagine reports from voyages down the eastern coast of South America arriving in fragments. One source knows a stretch of Brazil, another gives a river or cape farther south, another carries names from a different section of coast. The mapmaker tries to join them. The scale shifts, the orientation changes. A coastline that should continue south begins to bend east because the source being copied was angled differently, or because the sheet's available space encourages the line to turn, or because an older idea of southern land quietly influences the shape. The result is not random, it is meaningful, but its meaning lies in process, not in hidden precision. Early modern maps are full of such process. They often contain what might be called honest wrongness errors, created not by carelessness, but by the difficulty of assembling partial knowledge. A mapmaker may be careful, intelligent, and experienced, and still produce a coastline that modern viewers find bizarre. This is especially true at the edges of exploration, where ships have repeatedly sailed. Knowledge tightens, where reports are few. It loosens, where theory fills gaps. It hardens into imagined land. The southern Atlantic in 1513 was exactly such a zone. It was not blank to everyone, but it was not settled either. Sea level adds another layer. During the last glacial maximum, around 20,000 years ago, global sea levels were much lower than today because vast quantities of water were locked in ice sheets. Continental shelves were exposed in many parts of the world. Coastlines looked different. Human groups in some regions lived on lands now drowned by the sea. This has encouraged speculation that ancient maps may preserve memories of lost shorelines. In some cases, oral traditions and archaeological evidence do suggest that humans remembered or occupied landscapes later submerged. But this general truth does not automatically explain the Piri-Reis map. The map's disputed southern line is not a reliable depiction of a known Ice Age coastline, and connecting it to Antarctica requires assumptions far beyond the evidence. Still, the idea of drowned or hidden landscapes should not be dismissed entirely, because it reveals why map mysteries are so compelling. The Earth really has changed within human memory. Seas have risen, islands have vanished, river mouths have shifted, harbours have silted up, cities once on coasts now lie inland, and settlements once inland now lie beneath water. The ancient world was not mapped onto the same physical stage as the modern one. This is a legitimate source of wonder. But responsible wonder must move carefully. It must separate landscapes that changed within human timescales from continents locked under polar ice for deep geological ages. The Piri-Reis map also suffers, or benefits, from the problem of projection. The Earth is a sphere, but the map is a flat fragment. More importantly, it is not a modern scientific projection designed with transparent mathematical rules. It is a compilation built from charts and sources that may themselves have used different conventions. When one region is aligned with a modern map, another may fall out of place. If one chooses Africa as the anchor, South America shifts. If one chooses South America, islands move. If one tries to make the lower coastline match Antarctica, the rest of the map becomes strained. This is not a sign of secret complexity. It is the ordinary difficulty of old cartography. A lesser known but important point is that even maps made by skilled navigators could preserve direction better than distance. Portolan charts were excellent for certain kinds of sailing in known waters because they captured bearings and coastal relationships useful to pilots. But when extended over larger oceanic spaces and combined with newer discoveries, errors accumulated, magnetic variation, dead reckoning, uncertain longitude, inconsistent estimates of distance, and copying distortions could all affect the final shape. Latitude was easier to estimate than longitude, but even latitude could be imperfect. Before reliable marine chronometers, longitude at sea remained deeply difficult. A map of the early Atlantic world was therefore built under a constraint modern people rarely feel. East-west position was often uncertain in ways that could warp entire continents. This uncertainty helps explain why familiar shapes can appear in unfamiliar places. A coastline may be based on real observation but shifted by longitude error. An island may be copied from one chart onto another with a different scale. A cape may become exaggerated because it served as an important navigational marker. A river may be drawn too large because reports emphasized it. A southern coast may bend because its source was misunderstood. The map is not lying. It is showing the scars of measurement before measurement was fully mastered. The Antarctica theory also depends on the assumption that older means better. If Peary used ancient sources, and if a line looks strange, then perhaps the oldest source preserved the deepest truth. But old sources can be wrong. Ancient authority was not a guarantee of accuracy. Ptolemy was brilliant and mistaken. Medieval copies could preserve both wisdom and error. A map from the time of Alexander, even if such a thing were somehow involved through tradition, would not automatically contain a secret global survey. In early cartography, age often gave prestige, but prestige and precision are not the same. What survives in the record suggests that Peary Rice himself understood the value of compilation, but not in a modern critical apparatus. He gathered, compared, and produced. He was working within the limits of his age, and those limits were formidable. The fact that his map contains distortions is not evidence against his skill. It is evidence of the world he inherited. He was not drawing from satellites, standardized geodetic surveys, or global coordinate databases. He was stitching together reports from a planet in the process of becoming known to the imperial powers around the Atlantic. That stitching is visible. It should be studied, not smoothed away into myth. Yet the myth persists because Antarctica is the perfect canvas for lost knowledge. Unlike a misplaced island or a distorted cape, Antarctica is vast, remote, and hidden. It feels like the kind of place history could misplace. It has no ancient cities on its surface, no native human population in recorded history, no familiar ruins to anchor it in ordinary time. Its emptiness invites projection. A line on a map that might otherwise be read as cartographic confusion becomes, when attached to Antarctica, a sign of a vanished age. The continent's silence becomes evidence, when really it is only silence. There is a kind of tragedy in this, because the real history of Antarctica is already magnificent. It is a continent that preserves climate records in ice cores. meteorites on blue ice fields, fossils from warmer worlds, mountain ranges buried under frozen mass, and ecosystems adapted to extremes along its margins. It is not less wondrous because ancient sailors did not map it. It is more wondrous because its story belongs to deep time, to planetary systems far beyond human ambition. To force it into the Piri-Reis map is to shrink both the continent and the map. The better reading leaves each mystery in its proper scale. Antarctica remains a world of ice, bedrock, ancient climate, and modern scientific discovery. The Piri-Reis map remains a world of ink, sources, imperial intelligence, and early Atlantic uncertainty. Their stories touch because modern imagination has made them touch, but the evidence keeps them apart. The lower coastline on the map is best understood as a distorted or speculative land connected to South American geography and early modern mapping habits, not as a reliable Antarctic survey. That answer may seem to close a door, but it opens another. Because once the ice is allowed to remain ice, and the map is allowed to remain a map, the true drama returns to the sea. The question becomes not how a vanished civilization mapped a frozen continent, but how sailors in dangerous waters built enough knowledge for Piri-Reis to draw what he did draw. It brings us back to the age of pilots and storms, of secret charts and captured ships, of men who measured the world not from above, but from decks that pitched under their feet. The map's strange coastlines were not born in a lost Antarctic dawn. They were born in the hard, wet, dangerous labour of crossing oceans that still had the power to erase everyone who misunderstood them. The sea that feeds the Piri-Reis map is not the empty blue plain of modern atlases. It is crowded with terror. It has moods, traps, seasons, voices, and laws that no empire can repeal. To the sailors of the 15th and early 16th centuries, the ocean is not an abstraction between continents. It is a living field of risk, where knowledge is earned through hunger, rot, fever, mutiny, shipwreck, and return. Every line on a nautical chart has a cost behind it. A cape is not only a cape. It is a place where wind changes without warning. A shoal is not only a shallow patch. It is the sound of timbers tearing open in the dark. A current is not simply water moving through water. It is the invisible hand that decides whether a ship reaches home or vanishes. This is the world that makes early maps possible. Not quiet libraries alone, not royal courts alone, not mathematical theory alone, but sailors trying to survive repeated passages through dangerous seas. The knowledge behind a map begins with practical questions. Where is fresh water? Where can a ship anchor? Which coast gives shelter from a winter wind? Which island appears first after weeks out of sight of land? Which star rises over the course home? Which current pulls a vessel south when the crew believes it is sailing west? These questions do not sound grand, but they are the foundation of global history. Empires may claim oceans with treaties and flags, but sailors learn them one hazard at a time. By Piri-Reis's lifetime, the Mediterranean already has a long tradition of such knowledge. Pilots have crossed it for centuries, not as a blank sea, but as a known world of harbours, islands, winds, and political dangers. The Portolan charts that emerge from this maritime culture are practical masterpieces. Their coastlines are dense, their place names numerous, their compass roses connected by webs of rhumb lines. They are beautiful, but their beauty comes from use. They belong to men who need to know how one harbour lies from another, how a coast trends, where a ship can pass and where it should not. The Mediterranean trains mapmakers to think coastally, directionally, and pragmatically. The Atlantic, however, is different. It is larger, less forgiving, and to Mediterranean minds, long surrounded by fear and rumour. Ancient and medieval sailors knew parts of it well enough: the approaches beyond Gibraltar, the coasts of Iberia and Morocco, the Canary Islands, the routes of fishermen and traders. But the deeper Atlantic demanded another kind of courage and another kind of pattern recognition. Winds did not always allow a simple return along the same path. Currents could betray coastal logic. The open ocean forced sailors to trust absence, to move away from land in order to come back to it. That was a difficult lesson, and it changed the geography of the world. The Portuguese learned this lesson slowly and brutally. Moving down the west coast of Africa, they discovered that progress was not merely a matter of hugging the shoreline. The coast could be dangerous, the winds contrary, the currents exhausting. To return north, ships often had to sail far out into the Atlantic, catching wind systems that curved them back toward Europe. This wider manoeuvre, sometimes described through the broader logic of the volta do mar, the turn of the sea, transformed navigation. It taught sailors that the ocean had large-scale circulatory patterns. It made the Atlantic not just a barrier, but a machine of winds. What survives in maps is a line. What produced the line was repeated submission to the ocean's hidden structure. This is one of the surprising details behind early Atlantic cartography. Some of its most important knowledge was not visible as coastline at all. Wind patterns, currents, seasonal timing, and safe return routes mattered as much as the shapes of land. A map could show islands and shores, but the real map also lived in pilot books, sailing directions, memory, and disciplined habit. A vessel could have a chart and still be lost if the pilot did not understand the season. A coastline could be accurately drawn and still be deadly if the approach was mistimed. Geography at sea was never only position, it was motion. The Piri Reis map reflects this world of moving knowledge. Its coastlines may be inked on skin, but behind them are voyages, captures, copied charts, and maritime intelligence. Piri himself, as a naval man, would have understood the difference between decorative geography and useful geography. His later book of navigation shows a mind attentive to harbours, islands, approaches, and dangers. He was not simply interested in where land existed. He was interested in how ships encountered it. That practical sensibility helps explain why his world map, even where distorted, belongs to a serious nautical tradition rather than pure fantasy. The sea also made information valuable enough to hide. In the age of Atlantic expansion, charts were not merely educational objects. They were strategic assets, a route to a rich coast, a reliable passage around a cape, a new island suitable for resupply, or a current that shortened return voyages could shift wealth and power. Portugal and Spain had strong reasons to guard navigational knowledge. Their pilots, charts, and route books were part of imperial competition. But secrecy at sea is always imperfect. Ships are captured by enemies, sailors are taken prisoner, pilots are bribed or coerced, maps are copied in port. A chart locked in one archive may reappear in another language, under another ruler, serving another ambition. This is where the Ottoman world enters the Atlantic story, not as a passive observer but as a hungry collector of knowledge. Ottoman power was rooted in the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, the Balkans, Anatolia, the Levant, Egypt, and the routes toward the Red Sea and Indian Ocean. But the rise of Portuguese sea power around Africa and Spanish expansion westward mattered deeply. Trade routes were shifting. Rival empires were learning how to bypass older commercial systems. Naval intelligence became a necessity. An Ottoman admiral who could gather Atlantic charts was not indulging idle curiosity. He was reading the future. The Mediterranean corsair world sharpened this process. North African ports, Ottoman commanders, Christian fleets, merchants, and private raiders formed an unstable maritime frontier. Violence and exchange were intertwined. A captured ship might yield cargo, prisoners, languages, rumours, and charts. A skilled pilot might be more valuable alive than dead. A captive who had sailed to the Western Ocean might carry knowledge no official embassy would provide. The sea does not respect the neat categories of enemy and informant. In wartime, knowledge often travels through defeat. Piri Reis's own life belonged to this hard maritime culture. He served in campaigns, knew the habits of naval conflict, and came from a family connected to corsair activity and Ottoman service. This background makes his access to varied cartographic sources more plausible, not less. He lived in a world where charts could be trophies. A map from a Spanish or Portuguese ship might be copied, studied, and absorbed. A rumour from an Atlantic pilot might be tested against older material. A fragment from one tradition could be joined to another. The Piri Reis map is, in this sense, a maritime intelligence document as much as a geographical artwork. The dangers of the sea also explain why errors persisted. A chart that worked well for one purpose might be copied into a context where its limitations became serious. Portolan charts could be excellent in coastwise navigation, but less suited to constructing a mathematically consistent world map. Sailing directions might preserve sequences of places without giving accurate longitudes. Reports from pilots might exaggerate distances because days at sea depend on wind and current. A mapmaker compiling such sources might faithfully preserve information and still create distortions. The error is not necessarily in the sailor's observation. It may arise when one kind of knowledge is forced to serve another kind of map. This is particularly important for the Atlantic world in 1513. The Caribbean, the Brazilian coast, the African coastline, and Atlantic islands came from different histories of travel. Africa's western coast had been explored by Portuguese mariners for generations. The Caribbean had entered Iberian maps through Columbus and later voyages, still tangled with Asian expectations. Brazil was new in official European knowledge, though quickly recognized as strategically important. The southern reaches of South America remained uncertain. Piri's map brought these regions together before the knowledge behind them was equally mature. The result is not one level of accuracy, but several levels stitched into one surface. The sea's violence shapes not only the content of maps, but their survival. Charts used aboard ships lived hard lives. They were exposed to damp, salt, handling, folding, smoke, and emergency. They might be corrected by hand, stained, torn, or discarded when replaced. A working chart was not always meant for eternity. Many of the maps that mattered most to sailors may have been worn out in use rather than preserved in libraries. This helps explain why the sources behind Piri Reis are lost. Their disappearance is not suspicious. It is normal. What is strange is that Piri's fragment survived at all. One can imagine the chain, though not in every detail. A Portuguese voyage records a coast. A chart is made or updated. A copy circulates among pilots. A ship is captured, or a sailor enters another service, or information reaches a Mediterranean intermediary. A mapmaker translates names, adjusts shapes, combines the material with older Portolan outlines and geographic traditions. Piri Reis obtains some version of it, compares it with other sources, and draws a world chart for an Ottoman sultan. At each stage, knowledge is both preserved and changed. A coastline becomes less like the coast itself and more like the history of people transmitting it. This is why the Age of Dangerous Seas gives the map its real depth. The ocean was not merely crossed, it was interpreted. Each voyage turned experience into memory. Each memory had to be trusted, corrected, copied, and sometimes doubted. Scholars still debate the exact mixture of sources in the Piri Reis map, and the evidence remains incomplete, but the broad pattern is clear. It was born from a world where practical navigation and imperial rivalry were inseparable. The map is a relic of danger disciplined into line work. There is human cost hidden beneath that line work. The Atlantic expansion that produced new geographic knowledge also produced enslavement, conquest, disease, and the violent disruption of indigenous worlds. Charts made navigation possible, and navigation made empire more effective. To admire the map's technical achievement without remembering this would flatten its history. The same routes that carried information also carried raiders, colonists, missionaries, soldiers, forced labor, and extraction. A map can be beautiful and still belong to a brutal age. The Piri Reis map does not escape that tension. It is part of the machinery by which distant lands became reachable, claimable, and vulnerable. And yet the sailors themselves were not gods of conquest. Many were poor, frightened, coerced, ambitious, skilled, superstitious, exhausted, and expendable. They lived between orders from above and storms from below. Their knowledge was built not in clean heroic arcs, but in cramped decks, rotten food, uncertain wages, and the constant nearness of death. A map line may look elegant in a museum. At sea, that line was paid for by men who did not know whether the next coast would save them or kill them. This returns us to the strange authority of the Piri Reis map. It seems to show more than it should because it concentrates so many journeys into one object. The viewer sees a coastline and forgets the chain of voyages behind it. The map compresses decades of exploration, centuries of chart-making, and thousands of acts of memory into a single surface. Compression feels like magic when the process is invisible. But the process was not magic. It was accumulation under pressure. By following that pressure, the impossible becomes more understandable without becoming less fascinating. The map does not require ancient aircraft, vanished surveyors, or Antarctic secrets. It requires sailors, pilots, storms, imperial hunger, old chart-making traditions, and the dangerous circulation of knowledge across rival worlds. Those forces are enough to explain much of its wonder. They also lead toward another silence behind the map: the vanished libraries, archives, charts, and source materials from which Piri drew. The sea may have carried the knowledge, but archives decided what survived, and many of those archives have left only shadows. Behind every surviving old map there is a larger invisible archive. The sheet under glass is only the part that escaped. Around it, like a darkened room beyond a candle, are the charts that disappeared, the books that burned, the scraps worn out at sea, the palace records discarded during regime changes, the private collections broken apart, the shipboard documents soaked, stolen, or destroyed. The Piri Reis map feels mysterious partly because it is incomplete, but also because it points so clearly toward materials that no longer exist. Piri tells us he used many sources, and then history quietly removes most of them from reach. What remains is not a full chain of evidence, but a surviving link. This is one of the great frustrations of studying early cartography. Knowledge is not lost evenly. Some traditions survive because they were copied in monasteries, courts, or libraries. Others vanish because they were practical, secret, politically dangerous, or simply used too often to last. A beautiful ceremonial manuscript might be preserved for centuries, while a pilot's working chart, far more important to real navigation, might decay within a generation. The result is a distorted archive. Modern historians must reconstruct the past not from everything people knew, but from the small and accidental fraction that time allowed to remain. In the Islamic world, geography had a deep and varied life long before Piri Reis. Scholars wrote about roads, climates, seas, kingdoms, tribes, mountains, rivers, and cities. Administrators needed knowledge for taxation and rule. Merchants needed routes. Pilgrims needed itineraries. Astronomers needed coordinates and calculations. Sailors needed winds, stars, and coasts. These forms of knowledge did not always look like modern maps, but they were geographic all the same. A route list across Central Asia, a description of monsoon sailing in the Indian Ocean, a table of latitude, and a port guide to Mediterranean harbours all belong to the effort to hold the world in memory. The great libraries and courts of the medieval Islamic world served as gathering points for older and newer knowledge. Greek works were translated and debated. Persian administrative traditions contributed their own geographic understanding. Indian astronomy and mathematics shaped calculation. Travellers and merchants brought observations from Africa, Central Asia, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. What survives in the records suggests a culture of geographic curiosity that was practical, scholarly, and imperial at once, but much of it is fragmentary. Works survive in later copies. Maps are mentioned but lost. Titles remain without texts. Texts remain without the maps that once accompanied them. The archive is full of silhouettes. Piri Reis inherits this world, but he also inherits the losses. By 1513, Constantinople has already become Istanbul under Ottoman rule, and the city's libraries contain layers of Byzantine, Islamic, Persian, Arabic, Turkish, and Mediterranean material. Yet conquest, fire, neglect, reuse, and political change have all done their work. Manuscripts move, collections are reorganized. Some materials are treasured, others become obsolete. A chart valuable in one generation may be unintelligible in another. The evidence remains incomplete, and that incompleteness is not a small inconvenience. It is the central condition of the mystery. The reference in Piri's notes to older maps is therefore both valuable and dangerous. It confirms that he saw himself as a compiler of inherited knowledge, but it does not let us recover the sources in full. When he mentions maps associated with ancient authorities, modern readers may imagine a secret lineage stretching back to a lost scientific civilization, but in early modern scholarly culture, invoking ancient sources could also signal prestige, legitimacy, or broad tradition. A map said to descend from old authorities might contain actual old material, copied and recopied, but it might also contain reputation more than precision. Scholars still debate how to interpret these references, and caution is necessary. The names attached to sources can be as layered as the maps themselves. The loss of Columbus-related mapping is especially painful. Columbus's voyages produced reports and charts that helped transform European geography. Yet the earliest cartographic evidence is scattered and partial. If Piri Reis had access to a map derived from Columbus's own material, then his Ottoman fragment may preserve something otherwise vanished from the first shock of Atlantic encounter. But because the original is gone, certainty slips away. We cannot lay Piri's source beside his map and compare line to line. We can only infer from shapes, notes, dates, and historical possibility. This is how lost geography works. It leaves enough to suggest. not enough to close the case. Destroyed archives are not always dramatic. Sometimes knowledge disappears through ordinary usefulness. A chart on a ship is handled, folded, dampened, corrected, and eventually replaced. A coastal guide becomes outdated. A ruler's map collection is divided after death. A scribe copies the text but not the illustration. A parchment is scraped for reuse. A fire destroys a room that no one had catalogued. A conquered archive is moved, and in the moving, its order dies. Historians often dream of great burnings because they give loss a single scene, but much of the past disappears through smaller, quieter deaths. There were great burnings too. Libraries in the ancient and medieval world suffered from war, accident, religious conflict, political collapse, and neglect. The famous destruction of Alexandria has become almost mythic, though the reality was not one simple fire consuming all ancient knowledge in a single night. Its legend endures because it expresses a real human fear that entire worlds of thought can vanish. In truth, knowledge usually dies more slowly, across centuries. Through repeated damage, the tragedy is not always a blaze. Sometimes it is a chain of failures to copy. Maps are especially vulnerable because they are often large, visual, and technically demanding to reproduce. A text can survive if a scribe copies words. A map requires preserving spatial relationships, names, colours, symbols, and orientation. Copying introduces distortions. Place names shift between languages. Lines simplify. Decorative elements become mistaken for geographic ones. A careful copyist may preserve an error because the source looks authoritative. A careless one may accidentally create a new mystery. Over generations, a map can become a palimpsest of attention and misunderstanding. This matters for Piri Reis because his map appears to combine sources from different cartographic cultures. Mediterranean Portolan practice, Islamic geographical inheritance, Portuguese coastal knowledge, Spanish discoveries, and perhaps Colombian material do not fit together automatically. They have to be translated into one visual language. Translation is never neutral. A Portuguese place name may be rendered into Ottoman Turkish. A Spanish island name may be misunderstood. A coastline from one scale may be joined to another. A source with one orientation may be rotated or bent into the structure of a larger chart. The finished map is not merely a copy. It is an interpretation of sources that may themselves have been interpretations. The lost libraries of geography were not only buildings, they were human networks, pilots, merchants, captives, dragomans, scholars, spies, and craftsmen all carried pieces of the world. A ship's pilot might know more about one dangerous coast than any royal geographer. A merchant might know which inland road was safe after a war. A fisherman might recognize seasonal currents invisible to a court. A translator might turn a sailor's rough description into language a map maker could use. When such people died without being heard or copied, their geographies died with them. The archive of the world has always been partly human, and human archives are mortal. This gives the Piri Reis map a deeper sadness. It is not only a display of knowledge, it is a memorial to vanished knowledge systems. The sources behind it were once useful, perhaps even ordinary to those who handled them. Now they are gone, and the surviving fragment must bear questions that the complete archive might have answered easily. A misplaced island might have been explained by one source chart. A strange coastline might have been traced to a specific report. A note about Columbus might have been clarified by a known copy. Instead, absence turns ordinary historical uncertainty into legend. Yet one should not treat absence as permission to invent without limit. This is where responsible mystery differs from fantasy. Lost sources are real. Lost sources can explain surprising survivals, but a lost source cannot be made to contain whatever one wishes. The fact that Peary used maps we no longer possess does not prove those maps showed Antarctica, ancient global surveys, or prehistoric super-civilizations. It proves that early modern cartographic transmission was richer than the surviving record. That is already significant. The unknown should widen curiosity, not erase standards of evidence. The Ottoman context makes this richer still. The empire was a collector of worlds. Its territories and influence connected the Balkans, Anatolia, the Arab provinces, North Africa, the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and the Eastern Mediterranean. It stood near the crossroads of older land routes and newer maritime rivalries. Its scholars and officials had access to traditions that were neither purely European nor purely Asian, neither purely classical nor purely Islamic, but interwoven, Peary race. As an Ottoman naval figure, could draw from this environment while also absorbing intelligence from rivals. The map's existence shows that the Ottoman court was not geographically blind to the Atlantic. It was watching, collecting, and interpreting. There is a lesser-known irony here. Modern popular treatments often frame the map as a secret that challenges conventional history. But conventional history already contains the ingredients that make the map extraordinary. Islamic scholarship was sophisticated. Mediterranean cartography was practical and precise in its own domains. Portuguese and Spanish voyages generated new data quickly. Ottoman naval networks could acquire foreign intelligence. Archives were fragile. Copies circulated. Errors transformed. No single explanation fully accounts for every surviving detail. But the broad historical world is more than capable of producing a map that feels uncanny. The map is therefore a survivor from a crowded library of lost geography, not an orphan from nowhere. Its lines are the visible residue of a vanished working environment, charts spread on tables, sailors explaining coasts, scribes writing names, commanders judging what mattered, rulers receiving images of distant power. The missing sources do not diminish it. They surround it. They make it feel less like an isolated artifact and more like the last visible branch of a submerged tree. And once the story is seen this way, the mystery becomes quieter but larger. It is no longer only about whether one coastline matches a hidden continent. It is about how much of the world people once knew in forms that have not survived. It is about how knowledge crosses frontiers and then loses its passport. It is about the difference between the past as it was lived and the past as the archive permits us to see it. Peary Rice's map shows a world being drawn from remnants, and in doing so, it becomes a remnant itself. The next layer of the story lies not in ancient libraries but in recent voyages, in the Atlantic routes that fed new information into old systems. Columbus, Cabral, Portuguese pilots, Spanish reports, captured charts, and hidden routes all press against the map's surface. The vanished archive matters because it explains the silence behind the fragment, but the living voyages matter because they explain its urgency. The map was made at the moment when the Atlantic was no longer rumour, and the men who crossed it were changing what a map could be. The Atlantic entered the Peary Race map through routes that were still raw with danger. They were not yet the settled lines of empire found in later atlases. They were uncertain passages made by ships whose crews often misunderstood the very lands they had reached. Columbus crossed westward believing he had found the outer islands of Asia, and his error travelled almost as far as his discovery. Cabral's fleet reached Brazil while sailing under Portuguese ambition, and that coast soon became part of a larger struggle over oceans, treaties, trade, and secrecy. Between these voyages and Peary's table lay only a handful of years, but in those years the geography of the world began to tear loose from older expectations. Columbus's role is especially important because Piri Reis himself refers to a map associated with him. That note has made the surviving fragment feel like a faint echo of a lost original. Columbus's own charts have largely vanished, and with them much of the earliest visual record of how he understood the lands across the Atlantic. What survives in later copies, reports, and references suggest confusion as much as discovery. He did not simply find a new world and name it correctly. He tried to force unfamiliar islands and coasts into the geography of Asia. If Piri inherited Columbian material, he may have inherited that confusion too. The strange shapes in the Caribbean may therefore preserve not a secret accuracy, but a famous misunderstanding. This is one of the ironies of the map. Its value may lie partly in its errors. A clean, modern-looking outline would tell a simpler story. The distortions reveal the mind of an age struggling to place new lands into old categories. The Caribbean becomes a cluster of islands, names, hopes, and mistaken Asian associations. South America begins to appear, but not yet as a fully understood continent. The Atlantic is crossed, but its meaning is unsettled. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet the surviving lines suggest that Piri's sources came from the first unstable generation of Atlantic mapping, when information moved faster than interpretation. Cabral's voyage adds another layer. In 1500, Portuguese ships reached the coast of Brazil, whether by accident, design, or a mixture of route logic and imperial intent that scholars still debate. The Portuguese were already masters of Atlantic wind systems compared with many rivals, and their route towards southern Africa could carry ships far west before turning them back toward the Cape. Brazil entered their maps not as an isolated wonder, but as part of a wider oceanic strategy. Its coast mattered because it changed the scale of Portuguese power. It gave shape to the Western Atlantic and raised new questions about the division of the world between rival crowns. The Treaty of Tordesillas, signed in 1494, had already attempted to divide newly claimed lands between Spain and Portugal by an imaginary line through the Atlantic. It was a staggering act of confidence, drawing political ownership across spaces not yet understood. Maps became essential to such claims. A coastline was no longer only a navigational fact. It could become legal evidence, imperial argument, and financial promise. To know where land lay was to know who might claim it, exploit it, defend it, or deny it to others. In this atmosphere, charts were guarded, copied, stolen, and studied with urgency. Piri Reis's map sits inside that urgency. The Ottoman Empire was not a party to Iberian treaties dividing the world, but it could not ignore the consequences. Portuguese expansion around Africa threatened established trade routes linking the Mediterranean, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and beyond. Spanish expansion across the Atlantic promised new wealth and new power. An Ottoman admiral who gathered information about these voyages was not chasing curiosity alone. He was mapping the ambitions of rivals. Every coast on the map was also a warning. The hidden routes of the Atlantic were hidden in several ways. Some were state secrets. Some were simply difficult to explain to those who had never sailed them. Some were hidden by the ocean itself, because the correct path was often not the shortest-looking one. A ship returning from the African coast might need to swing far into the open sea to find favourable winds. A fleet crossing toward the west might follow currents and seasonal systems that made sense only through experience. The sea taught geography in loops, not straight lines. These loops shaped the routes by which information itself returned. As charts moved, they changed hands in ways that official histories rarely record cleanly. A Portuguese pilot could be captured, a Spanish sailor could talk in a North African port, a copied chart could pass through Italian intermediaries, a merchant could bring rumours from Lisbon, Seville, or the islands. A prisoner might describe a coast to save his life or improve his treatment. Piri Reis did not need direct access to the guarded archives of Portugal or Spain if fragments of their knowledge leak through maritime life. The Mediterranean was full of such leaks. War made them more likely, not less. The map's South American coast may preserve information from Portuguese exploration along Brazil. Its presence on an Ottoman chart so soon after those voyages shows how porous secrecy could be. But the coastline is not a perfect copy of modern Brazil. It is a 16th century understanding of Brazil, carried through uncertain channels. Some parts are recognizable because sailors had seen them. Other parts are stretched because their relationships were not yet fixed. The map therefore records not only discovery but transmission, the long transformation from landfall to report, from report to chart, from chart to copied source, from source to Piri's compilation. There is a lesser-known human detail here that gives the process texture. Early pilots often thought in terms of sailing days, winds, bearings, and landmarks rather than abstract coordinates. A coast might be described through experience after so many days. Under such winds, one reaches a river. Beyond it lies a cape. Farther along are people, forests, parrots, red dye wood, fresh water. Such knowledge could be extremely useful at sea and still difficult to convert into a geometrically precise map. When mapmakers turned lived routes into drawn outlines, distortion was almost inevitable. The map's oddities may be the residue of translation from voyage to image. The Americas themselves were not passive spaces waiting to be drawn. They were inhabited worlds with their own geographies, names, routes, alliances, conflicts, sacred places, and environmental knowledge. European and Ottoman maps often erase that reality by reducing vast indigenous landscapes to coastlines and labels. What Piri's sources carried back across the ocean was only a thin outer edge of worlds already known deeply by the people who lived there. This is another reason to be cautious with the word discovery. For the mapmakers of empires, the coast was new. For the people on the shore, it was home. That imbalance shaped the map. Early Atlantic charts often show coastlines before interiors because ships encounter edges first. The inland world remains blank or filled with imagined details. Rivers appear oversized because they invite entry. Forests become resources. People become notes. The map is not only a record of knowledge but of perspective. It sees from the sea, and the sea sees land as approach, anchorage, danger, and opportunity. This maritime viewpoint is central to understanding why the Piri Reis map can know the outline of a continent while knowing almost nothing of the lives within it. Columbus's hidden route, Cabral's landfall, Portuguese coastal probing, and Spanish island claims all converge in the map not as a clean story, but as overlapping traces. The Atlantic world is still new to the mapmakers who seek to own it. Reports contradict one another. Political claims outrun evidence. Old names cling to new places. Asia haunts the Caribbean. South America appears before its full continental identity settles. The southern end stretches into uncertainty. No single explanation fully accounts for every odd line, but the historical setting explains why odd lines should exist. The most important thing about these routes is their speed. In little more than 20 years after Columbus's first voyage, information about the Western Atlantic had reached an Ottoman admiral in a form detailed enough to be drawn. That is extraordinary, but not impossible. The early modern world was connected by rivalry as much as cooperation. Enemies studied one another closely. The more valuable a secret became, the more people wanted it, and the more chances existed for it to escape. Peary's map is a monument to escaped information. It is also a reminder that maps often lag behind voyages while also accelerating them. A ship sails first into uncertainty. A report returns. A map absorbs it imperfectly. Another ship sails with that map, correcting or compounding its errors. Knowledge advances through this cycle, but not smoothly. Some mistakes survive because they are copied. Some truths remain isolated because they are not believed. Some coastlines appear in outline long before anyone understands their scale. This is how the Atlantic became visible not in one revelation, but in repeated acts of partial correction. By the time Peary Race presents his map, the world is already becoming too large for inherited categories. The Atlantic is no longer a fringe sea beyond familiar civilization. It is becoming a central stage of empire. Brazil is no longer only a coast of trees and strange reports. It is a future colony. The Caribbean is no longer only a mistaken edge of Asia. It is a zone of conquest. Africa's western shore is no longer only a route downward. It is part of a global circuit. The map catches this transformation before it has hardened into the later world. And that is why the hidden routes matter more than the hidden continent. The real secret is not that ancient surveyors mapped Antarctica. The real secret is that knowledge has always travelled through channels more complex than official stories admit. It moves through sailors, captives, rivals, smugglers, translators, copied sheets, remembered bearings, and imperial anxiety. By the time it reaches the map, its path is nearly invisible. The line remains, but the journey that produced it disappears. The Peary Race map, then, is not a miracle dropped into 1513. It is an artifact of pressure. Portuguese pressure along Africa and Brazil, Spanish pressure across the Caribbean, Ottoman pressure to understand rival seas, and the constant pressure of the ocean itself against human ignorance. Its recognizable coasts come from voyages recent enough to be documented, but their arrival in Ottoman hands reveals the deeper circulation of the age. The world was widening, and no empire could keep the widening entirely to itself. Yet the same process that explains the map's strengths also explains its weaknesses. If information arrived in fragments, then errors would arrive with it. If charts were copied from different sources, contradictions would be stitched together. If Columbus misunderstood the Caribbean, his misunderstanding could travel onward. If Portuguese reports of Brazil were incomplete, the coast could stretch into guesswork. The map's mistakes are not random blemishes. They are historical evidence. They reveal the maker as clearly as the accuracies do, and to read them properly, the story must follow those wrong details into the heart of the map. A map's mistakes can be more revealing than its successes. Accuracy often hides its own history because a correct coastline seems to point straight to the coast itself. An error, by contrast, points sideways. It points toward a source, a copying habit, a false assumption, a misunderstood report, a political desire, or a technical limitation. The wrong line asks how it became wrong. The misplaced island asks why it was believed. The exaggerated cape asks what made it important enough to survive. On the Peary Race map, the errors are not embarrassing flaws around the real mystery. They are part of the mystery skeleton. Modern viewers often approach the map by searching for astonishing matches. Africa, Brazil, Antarctica, islands, hidden coastlines. But a historian has to look just as carefully at what does not match. The Caribbean is distorted. Islands are misplaced or confused. The relationship between South America and the southern land is strange. Some coastlines seem too compressed, others too extended. The map does not behave like a precise ancient global survey. It behaves like a compilation made from uneven materials. And this behaviour is exactly what one would expect from a 16th century admiral working with charts of different origins and reliability. The Caribbean is especially instructive. If the map preserved a secret tradition of advanced ancient geography, one might expect this heavily travelled region, newly central to Spanish power, to appear with increasing clarity. Instead, it carries the confusion of early encounter. The islands associated with Columbus's voyages are present, but they are not arranged in a clean modern pattern. Some forms seem to echo mistaken ideas that the lands lay near Asia. This matters because it suggests that Peary did not simply possess a perfect hidden source. He possessed sources marked by the misunderstandings of their own makers. The error becomes a fingerprint of transmission. Columbus himself is a key to this wrongness. His voyages opened European contact with the Caribbean, but his interpretation of what he found was famously constrained by expectation. He believed he'd reached the Indies, or at least lands connected to the eastern edges of Asia, and this belief shaped the way information was described and mapped. If Peary-Rees used a Columbus-related chart, he may have copied not only coastline data, but also the conceptual confusion attached to it. The map's Caribbean distortions may therefore preserve a vanished stage in European misunderstanding, carried into Ottoman hands. That is less sensational than a lost Antarctic civilization, but historically it is extraordinary. Errors also reveal the difficulty of combining scale. A chart of one coastline may be drawn from repeated sailing and relatively reliable bearings. Another may come from a rough report. A third may be copied from a map using different proportions. When a compiler brings them together, he has to make choices. He may preserve local detail at the cost of global fit. He may rotate one section to meet another. He may compress oceanic distances because his source underestimates them. He may place islands according to sailing tradition rather than measured longitude. The finished map then contains contradictions because the sources themselves were never designed to form one unified image. Longitude was one of the great hidden enemies of early mapping. Latitude could be estimated by the height of the sun or stars, though not always perfectly. Longitude at sea was far harder. Without accurate timekeeping across distance, east-west position remained uncertain. Sailors could estimate by dead reckoning, speed, heading, and time. But error accumulated with every current, wind shift, and human misjudgment. A coastline could have roughly correct north-south placement and still be badly displaced east or west. This helps explain why early oceanic maps can look both impressive and warped. They know where things are, but not always where they are in relation to everything else. The Peary-Rees map carries this kind of tension. It is not ignorant. It is not precise in the modern sense. It knows through routes, reports, and copied outlines. It does not know through a complete global grid. This distinction is crucial. A route-based geography can be excellent for movement and poor for projection. It can tell a sailor how to reach a coast and still misplace that coast on a world map. The map's wrong details remind us that navigation and cartography, though related, are not identical arts. Some mistakes may also come from duplication. In early cartography, the same island or coast might enter a map through different reports under different names, leading mapmakers to draw one place twice. A legendary island might be retained beside a real one because no one was certain enough to remove it. A coastline glimpsed from one voyage might be joined incorrectly to another. The evidence remains incomplete for every specific feature. but such patterns are common enough in the period to be historically plausible. The map's odd islands and forms may not be signs of secret knowledge. They may be signs of too much knowledge arriving in incompatible pieces. There is also the issue of authority. Older sources had prestige. A mapmaker might trust a respected chart even when newer information contradicted it, or he might combine both, unwilling to discard either. This could produce hybrid geography, where new coastlines coexist with old assumptions. In such a world, error does not disappear when better data arrives. It lingers, because knowledge is social. A line drawn by an authority has weight. Removing it requires confidence. And confidence was often scarce at the edge of the known world. The southern extension on the Piri-Reis map fits this pattern. Rather than treating it as a single puzzle to be solved by one dramatic identification, it may be better to see it as the product of several forces' incomplete knowledge of South America's southern limits, inherited ideas of southern land, the practical need to close or continue coastlines, and the distortion introduced by compiling multiple sources. Scholars still debate the details, but the important point is that wrongness here is historically meaningful. It shows the pressure of unknown space on the mapmaker's hand. A lesser-known but revealing feature of early maps is that they often look more confident than the evidence behind them. The inkline does not tremble. It does not tell the viewer whether it came from 10 voyages or one rumour. It does not fade at the point where observation ends. A coastline based on direct experience and a coastline based on speculation may appear equally solid. This visual certainty can mislead later generations. The viewer sees a firm line and assumes firm knowledge. But the firmness belongs to the drawing, not necessarily to the data. This is one reason the Piri-Reis map became fertile ground for extraordinary theories. Its errors are drawn beautifully. Its uncertainties are given form. The map does not look like hesitation. It looks like revelation. A modern audience trained to treat maps as authoritative can mistake old cartographic confidence for empirical precision. The result is a perfect misunderstanding. The map seems to know something impossible because it does not visually confess where it is guessing. But when the errors are read historically, they bring Piri closer rather than pushing him into myth. One can almost see the work of compilation a known coast here, a copied island there, a note from one source, a line extended from another, a southern curve inherited or inferred because blankness was unsatisfying. This does not reduce his achievement. It makes it more human. He was not a passive copyist. He was a maker of order under conditions of uncertainty. That is difficult work. And its difficulty remains visible in the mistakes. The errors also reveal the politics of knowledge. A map intended for a ruler may emphasize possession of information as much as exactness. To present a broad image of the Atlantic world to Sultan Selim I was to demonstrate reach. It showed that Ottoman intelligence could gather what Iberian powers might prefer to hide. The map did not need to be perfect to be valuable. It needed to show awareness. It needed to place new lands within an Ottoman field of vision. In that sense, even its inaccuracies belong to power, because they mark the attempt to see. There is something almost intimate about studying wrong lines. They preserve decisions that no text explains. A coastline bends where the maker chose to bend it. An island remains because he chose not to erase it. A note survives because he thought it worth writing down. The map's mistakes are moments of thought fixed in ink. They show not only what Piri knew, but what he was willing to believe. This is why the map's wrong details are more valuable than a fantasy of perfection. A perfect ancient world map would stand outside its time, inexplicable except by rewriting history. The Piri-Reis map stands deeply inside its time. Its errors tie it to Columbus's confusion, Portuguese secrecy, Mediterranean chart-making, uncertain longitude, source compilation, and Ottoman strategic curiosity. It belongs to the world that made it, and because it belongs, it can teach. The greatest misunderstanding is to think that debunking the impossible claim destroys the mystery. It does the opposite. Once the map is freed from the burden of proving Antarctica, every line becomes interesting again. The misplaced islands, the distorted Caribbean, the bent southern coast, the recognizable Brazil, the confident Africa, the crowded notes, the missing sources, all of these become evidence of a planet being reconstructed through imperfect human channels. The map is no longer a failed miracle. It is a successful artifact of uncertainty. And uncertainty is not weakness. It is the natural condition of knowledge at the frontier. The early Atlantic was not revealed all at once. It was assembled through mistakes corrected slowly, through voyages that misunderstood their own results, through charts copied before they were complete, through rumours that became lines and lines that became claims. Piri Reis's errors preserve that assembly. They show a world not yet fixed, a world still negotiating its own shape. So the wrong details do not lead away from the maker. They lead straight to him. They show Piri Reis as a man working at the edge of available knowledge, using what he could gather from a violent, connected, competitive sea. They show his sources without fully naming them. They show his confidence and his limits. They show that the map's deepest truth is not hidden under ice, but visible in distortion. A map is never only a picture of the world. It is a picture of what its maker could know, could borrow, could trust, and could not yet understand. The moment a map appears to know too much, imagination rushes in to protect the wonder. It is not enough for the object to be rare, early, damaged, and historically rich. It must become forbidden. It must become evidence that the accepted story of civilization is too small. The Piri Reis map has lived a second life in this realm, far beyond the hands of Ottoman sailors and palace archivists. It has been made to carry dreams of lost continents, vanished master cartographers, ancient global science, and knowledge supposedly hidden by cautious scholars. This afterlife is part of the map's history too, because artifacts do not stop changing when their ink dries. They change each time a new age asks them to answer a new hunger. That hunger is understandable. The past is full of disappearances. Cities have been buried by sand, drowned by rising seas, abandoned after drought, erased by conquest, or forgotten beneath later streets. Languages have died without being written. Libraries have burned. Wooden ships have rotted. Coastal settlements from the end of the Ice Age now lie under water where archaeologists struggle to reach them. The record is genuinely incomplete. No serious historian denies this. In fact, the incompleteness of evidence is one of the first things any careful historian learns to respect. But there is a difference between acknowledging loss and filling every silence with an advanced civilization. The idea of forbidden knowledge grows strongest where real evidence leaves gaps. A torn map is perfect for this. Its missing pieces become a stage. Its strange lines become clues. Its notes about lost sources become invitations. If Piri used maps we no longer possess, then what might those maps have shown? If one coastline looks odd, why could it not be a remnant of something astonishing? If ancient scholars measured the earth and sailors crossed dangerous oceans, why could there not have been an older science that vanished without a trace? The questions are seductive because each begins with something real. The danger lies in the leap. Fringe theories often work by arranging real facts into an unsupported structure. It is true that ancient people were intelligent. It is true that ancient astronomy and mathematics could be sophisticated. It is true that some old maps preserve earlier knowledge. It is true that coastlines have changed and archives have vanished. It is true that the Piri Reis map is unusual. But none of these facts, alone or together, proves a prehistoric global civilization with the ability to survey Antarctica. The theory borrows credibility from legitimate mysteries and then asks them to support a conclusion they cannot bear. Scholars still debate many details of early cartography, but debate is not the same as a vacuum. The appeal of lost super-civilizations also reflects a modern discomfort with gradual accumulation. Real history often advances through slow, uneven, messy processes. Sailors learning winds, scribes copying texts, scholars correcting tables, pilots sharing routes, rulers collecting reports, mistakes persisting for generations before being removed. This is not always satisfying. It lacks the clean drama of a vanished golden age. A single lost civilization feels like a key that unlocks everything at once. But the world usually does not give its secrets that way. Knowledge is more often sediment than lightning. There is also a certain loneliness in modern wonder. Satellite maps have made the planet look finished. Coastlines are instantly searchable. Mountains, trenches, cities, roads, and islands appear on screens with casual precision. The old terror of the blank space has diminished. So when an ancient map seems to restore mystery to geography, people respond powerfully. It suggests that the world may still be hiding an older story beneath the one we learned. The map becomes a rebellion against the flatness of certainty. It tells the viewer that perhaps the Earth was once known and forgotten, which is more haunting than simply unknown. But certainty can be resisted without abandoning evidence. The Piri Reis map is already enough to unsettle simple assumptions. It shows that the Ottoman world was connected to Atlantic knowledge earlier and more deeply than many casual histories suggest. It shows that maps could travel across enemy lines. It preserves hints of lost Colombian or Portuguese source material. It demonstrates the layered nature of cartography at a turning point in global history. It reveals how quickly information could move in a world without telegraphs, engines, or satellites. These are not small revelations. They are simply less mythic than Atlantis under another name. The forbidden knowledge story also depends on imagining mainstream scholarship as a wall built to keep mystery out. In reality, historians, archaeologists, geologists, and cartographers often live by mystery. Their work begins with uncertainty. They argue over fragments, revise chronologies, test assumptions, and sometimes overturn old models when evidence demands it. New discoveries do happen. Lost cities are found. Ancient DNA changes migration stories. Underwater archaeology reveals submerged landscapes. LiDAR exposes hidden urban networks beneath forests. The past is not closed, but careful scholarship asks evidence to lead, not desire. The Piri Reis map became famous partly because it sits at the intersection of real scholarly complexity and popular longing. It is technical enough to feel authoritative, damaged enough to feel secretive, early enough to seem impossible, and beautiful enough to inspire trust. Its inscriptions give it a voice. Its missing sources give it depth. Its disputed southern coastline gives it drama. Few artifacts are better designed, by accident, to become a legend. Yet legends often simplify the very object they claim to honour. When the map is treated mainly as a clue to Antarctica, the rest of it fades. Piri Reis becomes less an Ottoman admiral and more a messenger for someone else's imagined civilization. The Mediterranean world behind him disappears. Islamic geography disappears. Portuguese and Spanish intelligence networks disappear. Columbus's confusion disappears. The dangerous lives of sailors disappear. The map becomes a prop in a modern story about suppressed truth. That is a loss. A more faithful wonder allows the map to remain crowded. It lets Piri be Piri, not merely the last copyist of an unknown master race. It lets the map belong to 1513 with all the violence, ambition, brilliance, and error of that moment. It lets the southern coastline be uncertain without forcing it to become miraculous. It lets lost sources be lost sources, not blank checks for fantasy. It lets the past be strange in its own way. There is deeper reason this matters. Fringe theories sometimes appear to elevate ancient people by claiming they possessed impossible knowledge, but they can also erase the real achievements of known cultures, the patient work of Mediterranean pilots, Islamic scholars, Ottoman naval officers, Portuguese navigators, indigenous guides, translators, and countless unnamed sailors becomes less visible when all surprise is credited to a vanished civilization. Real human networks are replaced by a single imaginary ancestor. The story becomes grander but less honest. The allure of forbidden knowledge will not disappear, and perhaps it should not entirely. It keeps alive a sense that the past may still surprise us. It resists the arrogance of thinking every important question has been answered. It reminds us that absence is real and that the archive is wounded, but it must be held in balance with discipline. Wonder without discipline becomes fantasy. Discipline without wonder becomes dust. The Piri race map asks for both. Its true forbidden quality may be simpler and more unsettling than any lost continent. It shows that knowledge is never pure. It is stolen, traded, copied, misunderstood, weaponized, preserved, and lost. It crosses borders even when people build walls. It survives in fragments and then tempts later generations to overread them. The forbidden thing is not that an ancient civilization knew the whole world. The forbidden thing is that no civilization ever fully owns what it knows. Knowledge leaks. It mutates. It outlives its makers in forms they cannot control. That is why the map still holds the eye. It is not a final answer, but a dangerous surface, one that reflects back the questions brought to it. To a sailor, it might have shown routes and coasts. To a sultan, strategic awareness. To a historian, transmission. To a fringe theorist, a lost world. To a modern viewer, perhaps all of these at once. The map has become a mirror of desire, and desire is not always false. It simply needs to be questioned. Once that desire is recognized, the story can widen beyond Piri race. His map is not the only old chart to be called impossible. Other maps have carried similar burdens, strange islands, southern continents, accurate-looking coastlines, mysterious projections, places drawn before their supposed discovery. Some are genuine puzzles, some are misunderstood, some preserve lost information, some preserve fantasy. Together, they show that the Piri race map belongs to a wider family of artifacts standing between knowledge and imagination, where the world is never quite as certain as it looks. The Piri race map is the most famous of its kind, but it is not alone. History is scattered with maps that seem, at first glance, to know too much, to remember too much, or to imagine with such confidence that later viewers mistake imagination for evidence. Some show islands that do not exist. Some show continents before they were fully explored. Some preserve coastlines from older sources now lost. Some combine serious observation with legends that had already been travelling for centuries. Together, they form a strange gallery of impossible maps, not because they truly overturn the history of the world, but because they reveal how difficult it is to separate knowledge, copying, hope, politics, and error once they've been drawn into a single image. One of the most important comparisons is with the maps that grew from the Ptolemaic tradition. When Ptolemy's geography returned to prominence in Renaissance Europe, it offered a powerful coordinate system and a vision of the known world rooted in ancient scholarship. It was sophisticated, mathematical, and deeply influential. It was also wrong in significant ways. Its longitude stretched Asia too far east. Its estimate of the Earth's circumference encouraged the belief that the ocean between Europe and Asia was narrower than it truly is, and its Indian Ocean was often inherited as more enclosed than later voyages would prove. Yet these errors did not make Ptolemy foolish. They show how a brilliant system can preserve flawed data with extraordinary authority. That authority shaped real history. Old maps did not merely reflect voyages, they helped inspire them. The belief that Asia might be reached by sailing west across a manageable ocean did not come from ignorance alone. It came partly from learned geography, miscalculation, and inherited compression of the globe. In this sense, an inaccurate map helped make accurate discovery possible, though not in the way its users expected. The error became an engine. This is one of the great ironies of cartography. A wrong world can still move ships through the real one. The Waldseemüller map of 1507 offers another kind of astonishment. It is famous for applying the name America to the newly recognized lands across the Atlantic, and for showing a separate western continent at a time when European understanding of the New World was still unstable. To modern eyes, this can seem startlingly advanced, but the map was not a miracle. It was a learned synthesis of reports, travel accounts, classical geography, and bold interpretation. Its makers were trying to make sense of new information, and were willing to imagine a continental form beyond what had been fully mapped. Like the Piri Reis map, it shows the world being intellectually reorganized before every coastline was known. Then there are the Portolan charts, which can seem almost uncanny in a different way. Some medieval Portolan maps show the Mediterranean with such practical accuracy that people have long debated how their makers achieved it. The coastlines appear far more precise than many symbolic medieval world maps, and their dense webs of compass lines give them an air of technical mastery. Scholars still debate the exact origins and methods behind the earliest Portolans, but the most grounded explanations point toward accumulated sailing experience, compass use, coastal pilots, and careful copying. Their mystery is not that they came from impossible technology. It is that human practice, repeated over generations, can produce results that look sudden in the surviving archive. The Cantino planisphere, smuggled from Portugal to Italy in 1502, shows yet another side of map-making espionage. It depicts Portuguese discoveries at a crucial moment, including parts of Africa, India, and Brazil, and it reveals how geographic knowledge could become a stolen political asset. This map helps explain the world in which Piri Reis worked. Charts were not neutral scholarly diagrams. They were guarded information. They could be bought, copied, or smuggled because they mattered. A map could carry the outline of an empire's ambition. The Cantino planisphere makes the secret life of cartography visible, and in doing so, it makes Piri's access to Iberian-derived information easier to understand. Other maps are famous because they preserve fantasies with remarkable confidence. Medieval Mapae Mundi placed Jerusalem near the centre, arranged the world according to theology and classical inheritance, and filled margins with monstrous peoples, distant marvels, and symbolic geography. These maps were not failed atlases. They were visual encyclopedias of meaning. They told viewers where humanity stood in sacred history as much as where rivers and cities lay. To judge them only by coastlines is to misunderstand them. Yet when later viewers see a strange land or creature on such maps, they may treat it as a literal claim, forgetting that the map's purpose was never purely navigational. The island of High Brazil, appearing on maps of the Atlantic for centuries, shows how a phantom place can live a long cartographic life. Drawn west of Ireland on numerous charts, it shifted, split, shrank, and eventually disappeared as exploration failed to confirm it. Its persistence does not prove that a lost island once stood there in historical times, though real islands, banks, fogs, optical effects, and sailors' tales may have contributed to the legend. It proves that maps can preserve expectation. Once a place enters cartographic tradition, it can become easier to copy than to erase. Absence has to be proven repeatedly before ink will surrender. The same pattern appears in other phantom islands, Antillia, St. Brendan's Island, Friesland, and many more. Some emerge from legend, some from misread reports, some from duplicated real places, some from navigational error. Their lives on maps could last centuries. This is a lesser-known but crucial fact for understanding supposed impossibilities. A mapped place is not automatically a known place. Ink gives authority, but authority can be inherited from error. The Piri-Reis map's odd features belong to a cartographic world where real discovery and phantom geography often shared the same surface. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 has also been drawn into claims about Antarctica, much like Piri-Reis. It shows a large southern landmass labelled in ways connected to the old idea of Terra Australis. To those looking for lost ancient knowledge, it can appear as another clue that Antarctica was mapped before official discovery. But a large southern continent on a 16th century map is exactly what one might expect from inherited theories of balance and speculation, especially before explorers had disproven the imagined land's full extent. The map's southern land is not a photograph of Antarctica. It is part of a long intellectual tradition that expected the unknown south to contain land. This is where the comparison becomes useful. If one impossible-looking map existed alone, perhaps it would bear more weight. But when many old maps show strange southern lands, phantom islands, distorted coasts, and bold, unknown regions, a pattern appears. The pattern is not secret global precision. It is the normal behavior of cartography before complete exploration. Mapmakers combined observation with theory. They copied respected sources. They filled blanks. They allowed old places to linger. They drew the unknown with confidence because blankness was uncomfortable, politically inconvenient, or philosophically unsatisfying. The Mercator maps of the 16th century add yet another layer. Mercator's projection would later become one of the most famous ways of representing the globe, especially useful for navigation because it made constant compass bearings appear as straight lines. But it also distorted size dramatically toward the poles. This reminds us that even mathematically sophisticated maps sacrifice one truth to preserve another. A map is never the world. It is a method of seeing. If this is true of modern projections, it is even more true of early compilations like Piri's. Distortion is not always a mistake. Sometimes it is the price of a chosen purpose. Chinese maps, Islamic maps, European portolans, indigenous spatial traditions, Polynesian stick charts, Roman itineraries, and medieval world diagrams all show that mapping is not one universal act. Different societies mapped different needs. A Polynesian stick chart could encode swell patterns, island relationships, and navigational experience in a form that looks nothing like a European atlas. A Roman itinerary could privilege roads and distances over accurate land shape. An Islamic regional geography might combine climate zones, routes, and descriptions. An indigenous map might preserve territorial, spiritual, and ecological relationships ignored by imperial cartography. When modern viewers ask whether an old map is accurate, they first have to ask accurate for what? This question reshapes the Piri race map. It was not a modern school atlas. It was not a satellite image. It was not a secret prehistoric survey. It was a nautical imperial compilation, made in a world of dangerous seas, rival powers, old authorities, and new coastlines. Its accuracy must be judged according to that world. It succeeds in showing that Atlantic information had reached the Ottoman sphere. It succeeds in gathering multiple geographic traditions. It succeeds in preserving vanished sources. It fails, if judged by modern coordinates, in ways that reveal exactly how it was made. Other impossible maps teach humility in both directions. They warn against dismissing old cartography as crude, because many old maps are far more intelligent than they first appear. They also warn against treating every surprising resemblance as proof of lost science. Human beings have always been skilled pattern makers. Map makers and map readers alike complete shapes. They infer continuity. They trust inherited lines. They see what their age has trained them to see. The map is not only a record of space, it is a record of expectation. The Piri race map belongs in this family because it combines brilliance and wrongness so vividly. Like portolan charts, it preserves practical maritime knowledge. Like Ptolemaic maps, it inherits older authority. Like the Cantino planisphere, it belongs to a world of secrecy and stolen geography. Like maps of Terra Australis, it touches the speculative south. Like Phantom Island charts, it shows how uncertain information can harden into ink. Its uniqueness lies not in being outside cartographic history, but in bringing so many cartographic histories together on one damaged sheet. And perhaps that is why it has endured more powerfully than many maps that are cleaner or more complete. A perfect map leaves little room for longing. A wholly imaginary map leaves little room for trust. The Piri Reis map lives between them. It gives enough truth to hold the eye and enough uncertainty to trouble the mind. It is neither a fantasy nor a modern survey. It is a threshold object, and threshold objects invite stories. Seen beside other impossible maps, it becomes clear that the true wonder is not one hidden continent. The true wonder is the human compulsion to draw beyond certainty. Again and again, across cultures and centuries, people have refused to leave the unknown empty. They filled it with monsters, saints, islands, southern continents, trade routes, coastlines, warnings, hopes, and political claims. Sometimes they were wrong. Sometimes they were closer than they knew. Sometimes their errors guided others toward truth. The world on paper was always a negotiation between evidence and imagination. The Piri race map stands at one of the most dramatic moments in that negotiation. The old world maps had not yet died. The modern world map had not yet been born. Between them, on torn skin, an Ottoman admiral gathered fragments of a planet in upheaval. Other maps help us see that this was not impossible. It was human. And because it was human, it preserved something even more fragile than geography, the memory of how uncertain the world felt when its edges were still moving. What the Piri Reis map really preserves is not a perfect image of a lost world. It preserves the act of remembering one, not remembering in the simple sense of a person recalling a place, but remembering across cultures, ships, languages, archives, wars, and copying hands. Its surface is a gathering place for memory that no single mind could have held. The map remembers Africa through Portuguese voyages and older coastal traditions. It remembers the Caribbean through Columbus and the confusion he carried back with him. It remembers Brazil through early reports that moved faster than imperial secrecy could contain. It remembers classical and Islamic geography through inherited habits of compilation. And it remembers uncertainty everywhere, even where the ink pretends to be sure. This is the deeper wonder. A map is often treated as a statement of possession, as if drawing a coastline means mastering it. But the Piri Reis map shows something more fragile. It shows knowledge in transit. It shows how one age receives pieces from another, reshapes them, and passes them forward without fully understanding everything it has inherited. A coastline can survive after the chart that first recorded it is gone. A place name can outlive the language in which it was first written. A sailor's observation can enter a palace document centuries after similar observations began. In this way, maps are not only tools of geography, they are vessels of time. The surviving fragment matters precisely because it is fragmentary. If the whole chart had survived, some mysteries might be smaller. The missing portions may have shown how Piri organized the wider world, how he joined the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, how he represented Asia, or how he balanced old authorities with new reports. Their absence leaves the map suspended, and this suspension has helped create its legend. But it also teaches something true about history. The past rarely arrives complete. It comes torn, stained, copied, translated, mistranslated, and unevenly preserved. The historian's task is not to make the fragment say everything, but to hear what it can honestly say. What it honestly says is remarkable. It says that by 1513 the news of the Atlantic had entered Ottoman cartographic awareness. It says that information from rival powers could be gathered, reworked, and presented to a sultan. It says that the Mediterranean world remained deeply connected to the oceanic transformations happening beyond Gibraltar. It says that early modern map-making was not a clean replacement of old knowledge by new knowledge, but a layering of both. The evidence remains incomplete, but the surviving map is enough to show a world more connected than simple narratives allow. The map also preserves the memory of lost sources. This point cannot be overstated. Piri's notes do not merely decorate the object. They tell us that he worked from other maps, including materials now vanished. The fragment is therefore a witness to an archive that no longer exists. It is like a fossil impression of documents erased by time. We cannot recover every source, but we can see their pressure in the final form. The map is not only itself, it is the shadow of many other maps. This shadow quality is what gives the object its haunting strength. When people imagine that the map contains forbidden ancient knowledge, they are responding to something real. There are indeed absences behind it, but the absences do not point cleanly to a lost super-civilization. They point to the normal, tragic disappearance of working knowledge. A pilot chart used until it wore thin, a captured map copied once and then lost. A manuscript moved from one collection to another until its context vanished. A source whose errors survive more clearly than its name. This is how human knowledge often dies, not in one spectacular catastrophe, but by failing to be copied one more time. There is a surprising humility in the map when viewed this way. It does not show humanity as all-knowing. It shows humanity as persistent. People sail, measure, guess, compare, listen, copy, and correct. They get things wrong and still move closer to truth. They borrow from enemies. They preserve what they do not fully grasp. They make beautiful objects from incomplete reports. The map is full of mistakes. yet it is also full of effort. Its greatness lies not in supernatural accuracy, but in cumulative labour. That labour was not innocent. The knowledge preserved in the map is tied to empire, conquest, rivalry, and extraction. The Atlantic coastlines that appear on it were not neutral discoveries floating in empty space. They were edges of inhabited worlds, drawn from the perspective of ships that often preceded violence. The same circulation of knowledge that allowed Piri-Reis to map distant lands also allowed empires to plan routes, claims, and attacks. A map can preserve memory, but it can also sharpen power. The Piri-Reis map carries both truths at once. Still, the human desire to map is older than empire. It begins in orientation, in the need to know where one stands and how to return. A child scratches a path in dirt. A hunter remembers a valley. A sailor watches stars. A pilgrim follows stations. A ruler demands a province be described. A scholar calculates latitude. A map grows from all these acts, from the need to turn the dangerous openness of the world into something held, however briefly, by the mind. Piri's map belongs to this ancient impulse. Its political setting is specific, but its deeper impulse is universal. This is why the map feels alive even now. Modern maps are more accurate, but they often hide the struggle that made them possible. Satellite imagery gives the illusion of effortless seeing. The Piri-Reis map shows seeing as work. It shows the seams. It shows the joins between sources. It shows places where knowledge thins and imagination thickens. It allows the viewer to watch the world being assembled. That is rarer, in its way, than precision. The map's legacy should therefore not depend on whether it proves a disputed claim. It is more valuable than that. If it is forced to be evidence of Antarctica, it becomes either triumphant or debunked, and both outcomes narrow it. If it is allowed to be itself, it becomes a richer artifact, a damaged Ottoman world map from the early age of Atlantic expansion, preserving lost source material, practical maritime intelligence, inherited geography, and the uncertainty of a planet in transition. That description may sound less explosive, but it is far closer to the real marvel. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail on the fragment, and perhaps none ever will. Some source relationships may remain beyond recovery. Some distortions may never be traced to one exact cause. Some notes may keep their ambiguity. This is not failure. It is the condition of studying a damaged survivor from 5 centuries ago. History does not always reward curiosity with closure. Sometimes it offers a better gift, a clearer sense of complexity. And the complexity changes how the map should be seen. The lower southern coastline is no longer just a disputed shape. It becomes a sign of how mapmakers handled unknown space. The distorted Caribbean is no longer just an error. It becomes a trace of Columbus's mistaken Asia. The Brazilian coast is no longer merely recognizable. It becomes evidence of rapid information movement from Portuguese voyages into Ottoman hands. The notes are no longer decorative. They become the map speaking about its own ancestry. Every part of the object begins to carry more than one meaning. What the map really preserves, then, is the layered memory of a world becoming global before it fully understood what global meant. It captures the moment when old Mediterranean, Islamic, and classical geographies met the brutal new facts of Atlantic expansion. It shows an Ottoman admiral working not at the edge of ignorance, but at the edge of too much uneven knowledge. That is a more subtle drama than a lost continent, but it is also more human. The world that should not exist is not a perfectly mapped Antarctica hiding on gazelle skin. The world that should not exist is the connected world revealed by the map itself, a world in which a sailor in Ottoman service could gather fragments from Columbus, Portugal, Africa, the Caribbean, Brazil, ancient authorities, and Mediterranean chart-making, then present them as a single image only 20 years after the Atlantic had begun to overturn old geography. It should not exist only if one imagines history as tidy. It exists because history has never been tidy. The map survives as a reminder that knowledge is not a straight road from ignorance to certainty. It is a tide. It advances, retreats, leaves debris, returns with new force, and sometimes deposits a fragment far from where it began. Piri Reis's map is one such deposit. It washed ashore in history from many currents at once, and when it was found again in the palace archives, centuries after its making, those currents began moving once more, carrying the map into scholarship, speculation, controversy, and wonder. Its greatest gift is not that it solves the past. Its greatest gift is that it lets the past remain deep. The Piri Reis map leaves us in a world still half known. Not half known because people were foolish, or because ancient and early modern societies lacked curiosity, but because the earth was too large, too changing, and too resistant to be mastered quickly. Even in 1513, after Columbus had crossed the Atlantic, after Portuguese ships had rounded Africa, after Brazil had entered European maps, after old geographies had begun to crack under the pressure of new reports, the world remained unstable on paper. Lands appeared before they were understood. Oceans were crossed before their full systems were grasped. Coastlines were drawn before anyone knew what continents they belonged to. The map survives from that unsettled moment, when knowledge was expanding faster than certainty. This is why it still speaks so strongly. It does not show a completed world. It shows a world in the act of becoming visible. There is Africa, familiar but still shaped through the habits of sailors. There is South America, present but not yet fully known. There are islands that carry the memory of voyages, rumours, errors, and desire. There is the disputed southern edge, neither blank nor reliable, a place where knowledge thins and imagination takes over. There are notes trying to explain sources, discoveries, and stories, as if the map itself understands that it belongs to a time of transition. It is not silent. It is crowded with explanation because the world it depicts still needs explaining. In this sense, the map is a relic of intellectual courage as much as imperial ambition. To draw the world when the world is uncertain is to risk being wrong. Every map maker before modern surveying faced that risk. Leave too much blank, and the map seems ignorant or politically useless. Fill too much in, and speculation hardens into error. Trust old authorities too much, and new discoveries cannot breathe. Trust new reports too quickly, and rumour becomes geography. Piri Reis worked inside this tension. His map is full of wrongness, but it is also full of the will to gather, compare, and understand. The legacy of the map, then, is not simply a controversy over Antarctica. That claim made it famous. But fame can be a narrowing light. It shines so brightly on one disputed coastline that other parts of the object fall into shadow. The richer legacy is broader. The map shows how deeply connected the early 16th century world already was. It shows that Ottoman scholars and naval commanders were not isolated from Atlantic discoveries. It shows that Iberian exploration, Mediterranean intelligence, Islamic scholarship, classical inheritance, and practical seamanship could meet on a single surface. It shows that maps were never only about land. They were about power, anxiety, survival, and the movement of knowledge through dangerous channels. It also reminds us that the archive is fragile. The complete chart is gone. Most of Piri's sources are gone. The conversations that explained its choices are gone. The working maps from ships, the copied coastal sketches, the oral testimony of pilots, the lost Columbian materials, the palace handling of the finished chart, all of this survives only indirectly, if at all. What remains is enough to fascinate, but not enough to settle everything. Scholars still debate details because the evidence remains incomplete. That incompleteness is frustrating, but it is also honest. The past has no obligation to preserve the pieces most useful to our questions. And yet, even damaged, the map has outlived empires. The Ottoman court that received it changed. The Mediterranean order that shaped it shifted. The Atlantic routes it helped make visible became highways of conquest, trade, enslavement, migration, and ecological transformation. The modern world that now studies it is built, in part, from the consequences of the age it records. A line on that map is not just ink. It is connected to ships, treaties, violence, wealth, fear, curiosity, and the long process by which local worlds were forced into global contact. That is why the map deserves to be treated with care. To turn it into simple proof of a lost supercivilization is to flatten it. To dismiss it as merely wrong is to flatten it in another way. Its true significance lies between those extremes. It is a brilliant, flawed, layered artifact from a moment when the earth was becoming newly dangerous to old ideas. It does not overthrow history. It enriches it. It shows that mainstream history, when followed closely, is already stranger than the simplified myths built around it. The phrase "a world that shouldn't exist" therefore changes meaning by the end. At first, it seems to point toward a forbidden geography, perhaps a hidden Antarctica or a vanished ancient survey. But the deeper world that should not exist is the one history actually gives us: an Ottoman admiral in Gallipoli, gathering Atlantic secrets from rival powers, Columbus's mistaken geography echoing in an Islamic imperial context, Portuguese routes to Brazil appearing far from the archives that tried to guard them, ancient authorities still shaping modern discoveries, practical sailors leaving traces in palace art. This world should not exist only if the past is imagined as cleanly divided. The map proves it was not. It proves, too, that knowledge is restless. It does not stay where rulers put it. It crosses seas in the minds of captives. It slips through ports in copied charts. It survives in fragments no one knows will matter. It changes shape when translated. It becomes more powerful when combined, and more dangerous when misunderstood. Piri Reis's map is a record of that restlessness. Its lines are not merely coasts. They are routes by which information escaped. There is a strange comfort in the map's imperfection. A perfect map would belong only to certainty. This one belongs to effort. It shows human beings doing what they have always done when faced with the unknown, making patterns, preserving reports, trusting memory, testing old wisdom against new experience, and drawing beyond the edge of proof. Sometimes they are wrong. Sometimes their wrongness leads others closer to truth. Sometimes the error survives longer than the correction. But the effort itself is one of the defining acts of civilization. The Piri Reis map remains under glass, but it is not still. Every generation brings new questions to it. Some ask about Antarctica, some ask about Columbus, some ask about Ottoman intelligence, lost archives, Portolan traditions, or the politics of early exploration. Some simply stand before it and feel the old pull of a map that seems to know more than it should. That feeling is not false. It only needs guidance. The map does know more than a simple story of the past would allow. It does not know everything. It knows in fragments. and fragments are often how history tells the truth. So the final legacy of the map is not certainty, but humility. It teaches that the known world was always assembled from partial views. It teaches that lost knowledge is real, but not infinitely expandable. It teaches that errors can be evidence. It teaches that wonder must be disciplined, and discipline must not kill wonder. Above all, it teaches that the past is not a flat country behind us. It is a deep ocean, crossed by routes we can only partly reconstruct, filled with wreckage, memory, and sudden survivals. Piri Reis did not draw a modern world. He drew a world becoming modern without yet knowing what that meant. He drew a planet in transition, using inherited tools and unstable reports. He drew the fear and ambition of an age when the horizon had begun to move, and because one torn fragment survived, we can still see that movement, fixed in ink, 5 centuries later. The map grows quieter when the argument ends. The coastlines remain, but the noise around them fades the claims, the counterclaims, the impossible continent, the lost civilization, the careful corrections of scholars, the longing of those who want the past to open like a hidden door. What remains is a torn piece of skin marked by human effort. Someone drew those lines by hand. Someone gathered the sources. Someone believed the world could be held, at least briefly, in ink. And perhaps that is where its deepest mystery rests. Not in a secret Antarctica, not in a vanished master race, but in the fragile way knowledge survives at all. A sailor sees a coast and remembers it. A pilot marks a route. A chart is copied. A name changes language. A ruler receives a map. A palace stores it. Centuries pass. Empires rise, age, and fall. The men who crossed those waters disappear completely, and yet one fragment remains, still carrying the pressure of their journeys. The Piri Reis map reminds us that every civilization lives inside a partly known world. Even now, with satellites overhead and oceans measured by instruments, the human map is never complete. It is filled with things we know, things we think we know, and things we have forgotten we once misunderstood. The past is the same. It is not a locked room with one missing key. It is a shoreline in fog, appearing in sections, receding when approached, changing shape with every new light. So the old map does not have to prove the impossible to matter. It matters because it shows a world in motion, ships moving through storms, empires watching one another, knowledge escaping its owners, errors becoming clues, fragments outliving the hands that made them. It matters because it preserves the moment when the earth was larger than inherited imagination, and human beings were trying, with imperfect tools, to draw their way into the unknown. Under glass, the map looks still, but it is not still. Its lines continue to travel through every mind that studies them. They carry the Atlantic wind, the salt of dangerous seas, the silence of lost archives, and the uneasy wonder of a world that was never as simple as we wanted it to be. And in the torn space where the rest of the chart once continued, there is a final image, not a hidden continent waiting to be claimed, but the dark open edge of history itself, unfinished, fragile, and endlessly deep.